Chapter 36-22. Hidden in the heart. Nye Tian looked at Sect Master Qianquan with a gloomy expression. He was very surprised that the dignified Sect Master Qianquan actually did such a thing as peeping in the dark. It was really beneath his status. He had to admit that Sect Master Qianquan gave him a very bad first impression. Lord Sect Leader. At this moment, the group of martial artists below bowed respectfully. Ying Longshao, how dare you? How dare you attack Lord Clear Heaven Master? Sect Master Qianquan's gaze swept across the crowd and then fell on Ying Longshao. His face suddenly darkened. With a low roar, a terrifying sword aura soared into the sky, stirring up the void. Boom! Suddenly, a wave of sword intent spread out in the void, shocking the crowd and causing them to retreat. Looking at Sect Master Qianquan's appearance, he seemed to be very angry and was about to attack Ying Longshao. Longshao knows his mistake. Ying Longshao's eyes trembled and he immediately lowered his head, looking very nervous. How could he not know that if Sect Master Qianquan had not made a move, he would most likely be a dead man now? Don't do it again. Sect Master Qianquan's face darkened and he shouted in a cold voice. Then, the sword aura around him dissipated and the void regained its calmness. Nye Tian frowned as he watched from the side, a disdainful smile hanging on the corner of his mouth. With his experience, of course, he could see that Sect Master Qianquan was just acting. He put in enough effort on the surface, but he did not give Ying Longshao any real punishment. It was obvious that Sect Master Qianquan was just acting for others to see. To be more precise, it was for Nye Tian to see. Sect Master Ying Changfeng pays respect to the Master of the Sky. At this moment, the Sect Master of the Qianquan sect suddenly took a step forward and bowed deeply to Nye Tian, saying respectfully, "This." Ying Changfeng's sudden action stunned Ying Longshao and the crowd below. They exclaimed in surprise and were momentarily speechless. No one thought that Ying Changfeng would actually bow to Nye Tian in front of everyone. Wasn't this a public declaration that he acknowledged Nye Tian's identity as the Lord of the Sky? Sect Master is too polite. Nye Tian stared blankly at Ying Changfeng for a moment before replying with a faint smile. He had not expected Ying Changfeng to suddenly make such a move. However, as far as he was concerned, Ying Changfeng's actions were extremely pretentious. Although he did not understand Ying Changfeng's character at all, the latter's eyes were dark and deep, as if there was an extremely deep darkness hidden in them, giving people a feeling that they were bottomless. The Lord of the Sky has come to the Qianquan sect in person, and I, Ying Changfeng, failed to welcome you. Please forgive me for my rudeness, Lord of the Sky. Ying Changfeng became even more courteous at that moment. He spoke indifferently in a very sincere manner, but at the same time, he looked somewhat terrified. Everyone was even more puzzled when they saw Ying Changfeng's behavior. Ying Changfeng had never been so humble even when the big shots of the other four great forces had come to the Qianquan sect. Although Nye Tian was the Lord of the Sky, his identity had not been recognized by the five great forces. Ying Changfeng's current actions could not help but make people feel that he was expressing goodwill to Nye Tian in advance. What are you talking about, Sect Master? If you hadn't made a move just now, I'm afraid I would have been defeated by Brother Ying Longshao, Nye Tian said in a manner that was neither servile nor overbearing. The humbler Ying Changfeng's current attitude was, the more he felt that this person was unfathomable. He had seen too many shrewd people, but no matter how deep a person's heart was hidden, it would always be reflected in their eyes. Ying Changfeng's eyes were very different from that kind of pure sincerity. Lord of the Sky must be joking. If I hadn't made a move just now, I'm afraid the one who would have been defeated would have been Ying Longshao. Ying Changfeng was rather calm at that moment as he laughed heartily. Lord of the Sky is so young, yet you've cultivated your sword intent to such a pure level. You're indeed worthy of your identity as the Lord of the Sky. Nye Tian smiled and nodded, but didn't say a word. He really did not want to continue feigning civility with Ing Changfeng. Everyone, disperse. At that moment, Ing Changfeng nodded and swept his gaze across the crowd, as he said indifferently. The crowd nodded one after another and gradually dispersed. Lord of the Sky, follow me to the Universal Palace first, Ing Changfeng said to Nie Tian with a faint smile. Nie Tian nodded and moved, following behind Ing Changfeng in a very natural manner. Ing Longshao, Ing Tsangqiong, Lan Zhuying, and the others also followed. Along the way, Ing Changfeng asked Nie Tian some unimportant questions, to which Nie Tian answered calmly. Ing Changfeng introduced the situation of the Universal Palace to Nie Tian. He seemed to be very enthusiastic and seemed to trust Nie Tian very much. Soon, the crowd arrived outside a grand hall. The magnificent ancient hall was like a sharp sword that was 10,000 meters tall, piercing into the sky. The Universal Palace was a sword Dao sect. All the buildings were related to swords and gave off a sense of sharpness. Nie Tian, you must be careful of this person, the Ghost Emperor reminded Nie Tian in a low voice when they were about to enter the Universal Palace. Nie Tian nodded and turned his gaze, pretending to glance at Ing Changfeng. The latter seemed to have sensed it but did not react. This person hides his murderous intent in his heart, the Ghost Emperor said in a deep voice and said nothing else. The corner of Nie Tian's mouth twitched slightly. Hiding his murderous intent in his heart was exactly what Ing Changfeng felt. Lord of the Sky, please. Ing Changfeng bowed slightly outside the Universal Palace and gestured for Nie Tian to enter first. Lord of the Universal Palace, you're too kind. Just call me Nie Tian. Nie Tian smiled faintly and walked into the hall. As soon as he stepped into the hall, he immediately sensed a formidable pressure coming from all directions, causing his knees to sink, causing his footsteps to become heavier. It seemed that the Universal Palace was shrouded by a very powerful sword intent, and the terrifying sword pressure spread to every corner of the hall. Ing Changfeng glanced at Nie Tian and said with a smile, Lord of the Sky, the Universal Palace used to be the place where the previous lords of the Universal Palace cultivated. It is located in the core of the entire Universal City. The sword pressure is very strong, but don't worry. This sword pressure will not cause any harm to the swordsman. Oh, I see. Nie Tian smiled faintly and felt that the sword pressure had become much gentler. It seemed that there was a sword intent circulating in the void, and it had a nourishing effect on his sword intent. One could imagine that cultivating in such an environment would make it much easier for a swordsman to improve his sword Dao realm. Now, I've changed the Universal Palace into a place for swordsmen to cultivate. As long as you're an outstanding swordsman of the Universal Palace, you can cultivate in the Universal Palace. Ing Changfeng smiled faintly and continued. Lord of the Universal Palace is very open-minded. Nie Tian smiled faintly and nodded. It must be said that Ing Changfeng's decision to open the Universal Palace to anyone other than the Lord of the Universal Palace was indeed very good. Chapter 36:23. Chapter 36:18. Chapter 36:18. A brief lull. Nie Tian's eyes narrowed when he heard Ing Changfeng's word. He then smiled and said, I appreciate sect master's good intentions, but I'm not a swordsman of the Qiankuan sect after all. Forget it. Ing Changfeng seemed to have expected Nie Tian's refusal. He nodded with a smile and did not force it. On the other hand, Ing Longshao and Ing Tsangqiong were stunned, and they were unable to react for a long time. As members of the Qiankuan sect, they naturally understood how difficult it was to enter the Qiankuan palace to cultivate. Although the Universal Palace was open to all swordsmen in name, one had to obtain the approval of the Universal Gate Master in order to truly enter the Universal Palace. With Ing Tsangqiong's talent, it was his first time entering the Universal Palace. It could be said that he had benefited from Nie Tian. As for Ing Longshao, he only cultivated in the Universal Palace for 3 days. The moment Ing Changfeng opened his mouth, He allowed Nye Tian to come to the Universal Palace at any time. This was definitely a huge favor. Nye Tian, on the other hand, directly refused. At that instant earlier, Ing Sangqiong wished for nothing more than to stand out and remind Nye Tian how difficult it was to enter the Universal Palace. However, Nye Tian rejected him too quickly. He didn't even have time to remind him. Then, Ing Changfeng brought Nye Tian and the others to the main hall and gestured for them to take a seat. Nye Tian smiled faintly as his gaze swept across Ing Changfeng's body from time to time. He did not know why the latter had brought him to the Universal Palace. "Lord Master of the Sky, you came in a hurry this time, so I didn't have time to prepare. Please forgive me for my lack of manners." Ing Changfeng took a sip of tea and looked at Nye Tian calmly as he apologized again. "Sect Master is too courteous." Nye Tian forced a smile. Ing Changfeng's hypocrisy made him extremely annoyed. "Lord of the Sky, you've just arrived at the sect of Heaven and Earth, so you're not familiar with everything here yet. Why don't you settle down for the time being?" Ing Changfeng smiled faintly as he stared at Nye Tian with a strange glint in his eyes. "Sure." Nye Tian smiled faintly and readily agreed. Anyway, he had nothing urgent to do now, so he might as well take a break in the Qiankuan sect for a while. Although Ing Changfeng was eyeing him covetously, he assumed that Ing Changfeng would not dare to do anything to him since he was the Lord of the Sky. "All right." Seeing that Nye Tian agreed, Ing Changfeng laughed and said to Ing Sangqiong, "Ing Sangqiong, since you brought the Lord of the Sky here, he will stay in your sword palace for the time being. During this time, you can show him around the Qiankuan gate." "Yes." Ing Sangqiong stood up with an excited look on his face. He seemed very happy. In his opinion, Ing Changfeng had already accepted Nye Tian's identity as the Lord of the Sky. Then, Ing Changfeng did not waste any time and asked Ing Sangqiong to leave with Nye Tian, but left Ing Longshao alone. After Nye Tian left the Qiankuan palace, he followed Ing Sangqiong to the latter's sword palace. Any swordsman in the Qiankuan sect who had some talent or ability would have their own sword palace. Ing Sangqiong was very excited. Along the way, he brought Nye Tian around the Qiankuan sword palace. After walking around for a long time, they finally arrived at his own sword palace. "Nye Tian, this is my sword palace, the Firmament Sword Palace." Ing Sangqiong pointed at the sword palace in front of him and said excitedly, "Although it's a little shabby, we can make do with it." Looking at the Firmament Sword Palace in front of him, Nye Tian smiled faintly and did not say anything. In his opinion, the Firmament Sword Palace was not shabby at all. On the contrary, it was very majestic and almost comparable to a small palace in a realm. After a while, Nye Tian and the rest arrived at the main hall of the Firmament Sword Palace. "Nye Tian, I really did not expect the sect leader to acknowledge you as the owner of the Sky sect so quickly." Ing Sangqiong sat on the main seat in the main hall and laughed heartily. "I didn't expect it either." The corner of Nye Tian's mouth twitched as he responded. Ing Sangqiong obviously did not see any clues. He thought that Ing Changfeng had already acknowledged Nye Tian. Lan Zhuying sat opposite Nye Tian with a slight frown and did not say anything. Next, Ing Sangqiong arranged for Nye Tian and Lan Zhuying to stay. After Nye Tian made the arrangements, he let Duanmulu and the rest out of the 9 extremities to cultivate in the Firmament Sword Palace. The entire Qiankuan city was enveloped by the Qiankuan sword formation. It was the best place for swordsmen to cultivate. However, the next half a month was very peaceful, which was beyond Nye Tian's expectations. Apart from cultivating, Nye Tian would give pointers to Duanmulu and the rest. He would also spar with Ing Sangqiong and Lan Zhuying. Ing Changfeng did not appear for half a month. It was as though he had forgotten about Nye Tian. "What is the sect leader doing? Why isn't he coming to see us?" At this moment, Nye Tian and the rest were in the main hall of the Firmament Sword Palace. Ing Sangqiong grumbled with an ugly expression. "There's no hurry. It's good to cultivate here. Nie Tian smiled faintly and looked calm. He had a feeling that Ing Chongfeng was planning something. Could he be deliberately distancing himself from him to wear him down? However, it was really good to cultivate in the Firmament Palace. In just half a month, Nie Tian had a breakthrough in his sword principal realm. He had reached the fourth heaven of sword aura. As for Ing Tsangqiong and Lan Zhuing, their martial principal realm was much more stable under the nourishment of the Qiankuan sword formation. Nie Tian, let's go to the Heaven and Earth Palace together tomorrow to look for the sect leader. Ing Tsangqiong frowned and suddenly said to Nie Tian, "Why do we look for him?" Nie Tian raised his eyebrows and smiled. Ing Tsangqiong was stunned and was speechless. He did not know why he wanted to look for Ing Chongfeng. At this moment, he also noticed that something was amiss. Although Ing Chongfeng was very respectful to Nie Tian in public, it was just on the surface. He did not really acknowledge Nie Tian's identity. Moreover, Ing Tsangqiong knew that the sect leaders of the five forces each had an important item related to the heart of the sky. Ing Chongfeng had to give this item to Nie Tian to acknowledge Nie Tian. Don't rush. Let's wait. Nie Tian smiled faintly and was very calm. Actually, he was also very anxious. However, if Ing Chongfeng did not look for him, there was no point in being anxious. Boom! At this moment there was a sudden explosion in the void far away. Then, a sword aura soared into the sky like a dragon and rolled in the void. Huh! Nie Tian felt the aura of the sword intent in the void. His eyes turned gloomy and his expression changed. Then, he rushed out of the palace and saw a huge sword shadow standing on a strange peak in the distance. It was like a giant with a strong aura, and in that sword shadow, there was actually a person standing. Chapter 36-24. Qianya leaves seclusion outside the Sky Dome Palace. Nie Tian, Ing Tsangqiong, and the others stared at the figure in the sky. Their eyes could not help but tremble. Although they were separated by more than 100,000 meters, Nie Tian could clearly feel the powerful sword intent aura contained within the sword shadow. The figure in the sword shadow was dressed in white and held a long sword in his hand. The light from the sword was dazzling, and he looked like a sword god that had descended to the world. Boom! At this moment, the sword shadow suddenly moved, directly rushing up to the 9 heavens. In an instant, the sky rumbled and the earth trembled. A huge wave of sword will appeared, spreading in all directions. Nie Tian narrowed his eyes and his expression changed. This was the burst of sword intent when a swordsman made a breakthrough. Some swordsmen who were in seclusion could suppress their sword intents and release their sword intents the instant they broke through to a higher realm. At this moment, the sword will ripples formed by that swordsman in the void were extremely strong. This meant that he was extremely ambitious and wanted to break through to an even higher cultivation realm. Nie Tian's eyes trembled. He took a step forward and charged up into the sky, getting closer to the swordsman. At this moment, he felt an even stronger fluctuation of sword intent. Meanwhile, the swordsman's sword momentum was soaring wildly. The 6th heaven of Oracle! Nie Tian exclaimed in surprise as he sensed the swordsman's realm. Judging from his figure, this swordsman was very young. He was in the 6th sky of the Oracle realm. At the next moment, a shocking scene happened. The swordsman's sword momentum skyrocketed, and his sword Dao realm also broke through. 7 heavens of Oracle, the 8th heaven of Oracle. Oracle 9 heavens. Almost in the blink of an eye, the swordsman's sword realm advanced from the 6th heaven of Oracle to the 9th heaven. At this moment, the sword momentum of his entire body was still rising crazily. He's trying to break through to the realm of holiness. Nie Tian's eyes narrowed and his expression changed. He exclaimed in his heart. This swordsman was indeed ambitious. He wanted to break through to the holy realm from the 6th sky of the Oracle realm. At this moment, many onlookers appeared in the surroundings, their eyes trembling as they looked at the swordsman. Clearly, they could tell what the swordsman was planning. Boom! 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 The sword intent around the swordsman's body erupted madly, and his sword aura was like a tempestuous wave that struck ceaselessly, causing the surrounding space to rumble endlessly. However, after charging over a dozen times, his sword momentum began to weaken. Although he was ambitious, the result was not what he had hoped for. He failed and did not break through to the Holy Realm. A moment later, the swordsman's sword intent aura stabilized. His entire person was like a sharp sword, standing coldly in the void. At this moment, his face was very ugly. It was obvious that he was depressed because he could not break through to the Holy Realm. This person is so powerful. He can directly break through from the 6th heaven to the 9th heaven. Nie Tion's eyes slightly narrowed and he was quite shocked. Zhu is so scary. No wonder he's the universe swordsman. At this moment, the crowd finally reacted. They stared at the swordsman in shock and said his name. So he was Zhu, who was equally famous as Ying Longxiao for the universe sword array and titled Qianye. It was obvious that his talent and capabilities were above Ying Longxiao's. So he is Zhu. Nie Tian heard the crowd's discussion and the corner of his lips twitched. He had heard Ying Tsangqiong mention Zhu before, but he had never met him. He did not think that the first time he saw Zhu, it would be in such a situation. After 3 years of isolation, I still cannot break through to the Holy Realm. In the void, Zhu's eyes were downcast as he mumbled. His tone was filled with disappointment. Perhaps to others, the fact that he was able to directly break through from the 6th heaven to the 9th heaven was already very terrifying. But to him, this kind of breakthrough was far from enough. However, in the next moment, his gaze regained its sharpness. Like a sharp sword, his eyes revealed its sharpness. He was clearly not the kind of person who could not extricate himself from depression. His mentality was very good and he was very confident in himself. He firmly believed that he could do better next time. This guy is not bad. Nie Tian saw Zhu's reaction and said with a faint smile. He liked this kind of person who had perseverance and was optimistic. At least in terms of mentality, Zhu was already hundreds or thousands of times stronger than other genius swordsmen. At this moment, Zhu's gaze swept across the crowd and inadvertently saw Nie Tian. He frowned slightly and his expression changed slightly. It seemed that he was very interested in Nie Tian, or perhaps he sensed an unusual aura from Nie Tian. However, he only looked at Nie Tian from afar and did not speak. After a moment, Zhu's figure moved and he directly left. Nie Tian watched Zhu's figure disappear and his lips curled into a faint smile. He seemed to be thinking about something. Qianye, he was once the most promising swordsman. Many people thought that he had a high chance of becoming the master of the sky. At this moment, Ying Tsangqiong came to Nie Tian's side and looked at the place where Zhu's figure disappeared. He sighed and then looked at Nie Tian with a bitter smile. It's a pity that you beat me to it. The corner of Nie Tian's mouth twitched, but he did not deny it. Zhu's figure disappeared and the crowd also dispersed. Nie Tian and the others once again returned to the Universal Palace. Nie Tian sat on the chair and frowned. He felt that Ying Changfeng did not look for him for such a long time because Zhu was in seclusion. Perhaps Ying Changfeng was waiting for Zhu to finish his seclusion. While Nie Tian was lost in his thoughts, a figure appeared outside the Universe Sword Palace and called out, "Sect Master of the Vast Heaven Sect, the Sect Master wants to see you." So fast? When Nie Tian heard this voice, his gaze involuntarily darkened and his expression instantly changed. Zhu just came out of seclusion and Ying Changfeng sent someone to look for him. This was clearly not a coincidence. His guess was right. Ying Changfeng was waiting for Zhu to come out of seclusion. Nie Tian. Ying Tsangqiong stood up at this moment and had the same puzzlement on his face. "Let's go." Nie Tian smiled faintly with a calm look. He was waiting for Ing Changfeng to look for him. Faintly, he smelled a trace of a conspiracy. But he already came here and it was clearly impossible to retreat. He could only keep walking. Nie Tian was worried about Duanmulu and the rest. He let them enter the 9 extremes before heading to the Universal Palace. After a moment, they arrived outside the Universal Palace. At this moment, on the huge plaza outside the Universal Palace, 2 humongous sword shadows stood upright like 2 giants, constantly releasing horrifying sword-intent aura. And Nie Tian looked at those 2 sword shadows and his gaze involuntarily focused. In these 2 sword shadows, he sensed an intense array aura. Without a doubt, these 2 sword shadows should be a sword array. Chapter 36-25. Cosmos Sword, Cosmos Sword? Nie Tian was stunned when he heard Ing Tsangqiong's words. His eyes froze. Universe Sword. It's really the universe in the sword. Sect Master has actually activated the universe in the sword again. At this moment, when the others saw the 2 sword shadows, their eyes trembled violently and they cried out in surprise. It was as if they had seen a scene that shocked and terrified them. They did not expect Ing Changfeng to actually activate the universe in the sword. What is the Cosmos Sword? Nie Tian's eyes darkened and he could not help but ask Ing Tsangqiong. It's a powerful sword formation. Ing Tsangqiong's face was dark. After saying that, he did not continue. Nie Tian's face was filled with astonishment. He could also tell that the 2 sword shadows were a sword formation. But most importantly, what was this sword formation used for? At this time, everyone looked at the universe in the sword and began to discuss. The universe in the sword is open again. I wonder who will enter this time? Within the Qian sword and the Kuan sword, they possess the strongest sword wills. As long as one could enter them, they would be able to absorb the sword wills. For a sword master, this is an extremely great benefit. The clash of the cosmos will result in an intense suppression between the 2 sides, and it is even possible for them to devour each other. This is an extremely dangerous matter. Qianye and Zhuzia have just come out of seclusion. Could it be that Sect Master opened the universe in the sword at this time for him? If Zhuzia were to enter the Qian sword or the Kuan sword, I'm afraid that only Ing Longshao would have a chance to fight against him in the entire Qiankuan sect. If it were any other opponent, they would simply be courting death. As the crowd discussed, they looked at the universe in the sword with fervent gazes. People were very curious as to who would enter the sword universe this time. When Nie Tian heard everyone's words, his expression changed. He heard most of it, but he didn't fully understand. He could only tell that one of the 2 sword shadows was the Qian sword and the other was the Kuan sword. Later on, the Qian sword and the Kuan sword would both enter the swordsman realm. Moreover, there was an intense confrontation between the 2 sword shadows. It was as if the confrontation between the universe was an extremely dangerous thing, able to mutually devour each other. Nie Tian, I hope that the universe in the sword isn't open for you. At this moment, Ing Tsangqiong looked at Nie Tian and said in a deep voice. Nie Tian frowned. He did not understand why Ing Tsangqiong would say that. A moment later, Ing Changfeng's figure appeared with 2 young figures standing behind him. Nie Tian looked at the 2 and recognized them at a glance. They were the 2 Qiankuan swordsmen, Zhuzia and Ing Longshao. Zhuzia's figure was thin and his eyes were sharp. His entire body exuded a sharp aura. Ing Longshao was tall and sturdy like a pagoda. His face was gloomy, and there was a hint of viciousness in his forcefulness. In the next moment, Nie Tian's eyes narrowed. He suddenly realized that Ing Longxiao's sword principle had reached the 7th heaven of the oracle realm. How is this possible? Nie Tian couldn't help but be surprised. When he fought with Ing Longshao half a month ago, the latter was only at the 5th level of the oracle realm. In just half a month's time, his sword principle had improved by 2 levels. This speed was too fast. Could it be that the master has been letting Ying Longshao cultivate in the Universal Palace for the past half a month? Ying Tsangqiong, who was at the side, also noticed that something was wrong and could not help but wonder. Nie Tian frowned. He felt that what Ying Tsangqiong said was very likely. When he left the Universal Palace, Ying Changfeng left Ying Longshao alone. It should be to let Ying Longshao cultivate in the Universal Palace. However, Nie Tian did not expect the Universal Palace to be so terrifying. In just half a month's time, it allowed Ying Longshao to improve so much. At this moment, Ying Tsangqiong suddenly let out a sigh of relief and said lightly, "It seems that the universe in the sword is prepared for Zhu Zia and Ying Longshao." But in the next moment, his face darkened and he said, "Isn't it a little too cruel for the master to let Zhu Zia and Ying Longshao fight?" Cruel? Nie Tian was stunned and could not help but frown. He did not quite understand what Ying Tsangqiong meant. Although the universe in the sword is called a sword formation, it actually uses the sword formation as a battle platform for two swordsmen to fight. Ying Tsangqiong's face darkened as he said, "The two swordsmen will enter the Qian sword and the Kuan sword respectively and use their own sword intent to activate the sword formation's power to fight." And then? Nie Tian's eyes narrowed. He did not hear anything cruel about the fight. The Qian sword and the Kuan sword will fight against each other. Qian is heaven and Kuan is earth. Heaven and earth are opposites and only one can survive. Ying Tsangqiong's eyes darkened and he said coldly, "After the two swordsmen enter the sword formation, they will merge with the Qian sword and the Kuan sword. During the fight, the sword formation will devour each other. In other words, in the end, only one of the Qian sword and the Kuan sword can survive. The sword intent of the one who loses will be devoured by the other. There's even a possibility that their sword principle cultivation will be completely destroyed." When Nie Tian heard what Ying Tsangqiong said, his eyes narrowed and his expression changed. The battle between the two swordsmen was so cruel. The sword intent of the one who lost would be devoured. It turned out that the sword formation was used to allow the swordsmen to devour each other. This kind of fight seemed great, but in reality, it was much crueler than a normal fight. A swordsman's sword intent would be devoured and his sword principle cultivation would be completely destroyed. Could there be a heavier blow than this? The duel between the Cosmos sword is very cruel, but for the winner of the duel, it is very beneficial. Ying Tsangqiong explained, "The winner will use the power of the sword formation to devour the opponent's sword intent. Not only will he improve his cultivation, but his sword principle talent will also be improved." So that's how it is. Nie Tian's eyes narrowed. He did not expect the universe of the universe in the sword to be so huge. The seemingly ordinary sword formation was actually extremely dangerous. I did not expect the leader to let two universe swordsmen fight against each other. Ying Tsangqiong glanced at Zhu Zia and Ying Longshao with a terrible expression. Zhu Zia and Ying Longshao were the most talented swordsmen among the younger generation of the Qian Kuan sect. One of them would definitely be injured in the battle. To the Qian Kuan sect, there was no benefit at all. That might not be the case. However, at this moment, Nie Tian's lips twitched and he said with a bitter smile, "What might not be the case?" Ying Tsangqiong was stunned as he did not know what Nie Tian meant. It might not be Zhu Zia and Ying Longshao who will fight against each other. Nie Tian's eyes flickered as he said. He did not believe that Ying Changfeng sent someone to call him over just to let him watch the battle between the two universe swordsmen. Ying Changfeng was definitely not simple. Chapter 36-26. Sinister Intentions. Nie Tian could not help but frown when he heard Ying Changfeng's words, and his heart sank. He knew it would not be that simple. Everyone was stunned after hearing Ying Changfeng's words. They could not react for a long time as they tried to guess what Ying Changfeng meant. Could it be that Ying Changfeng wanted Nie Tian, the dominator of the sky, to participate in the heaven and earth duel? The heaven and earth duel was a battle of life and death. After all, Nie Tian was the dominator of the sky, so it did not seem appropriate for him to participate in such a duel. This, Ing Sangqiong, who was standing aside, was dumbfounded. He was so shocked that he could not speak a word. Does this mean that the universe in the sword is specially prepared for me? Asked Nie Tian as he stared at Ing Changfeng with a smirk. He was much calmer at that moment. That's right. Ing Changfeng replied loudly with a faint smile. Everyone's eyes trembled violently as they were extremely shocked. Ing Changfeng really wanted Nie Tian to participate in the universe duel. What if something happened to Nie Tian? How would Ing Changfeng explain it to the other four forces? In everyone's opinion, Ing Changfeng's action was extremely inappropriate. Although most people did not acknowledge Nie Tian's identity as the dominator of the sky, no one had thought of getting rid of Nie Tian. Dominator of the sky, I don't think I need to explain to you what the universe in the sword is. Ing Changfeng smirked coldly. He had already seen Ing Sangqiong talking to Nie Tian. No need. Nie Tian smiled faintly. He looked calm and did not panic at all. Very well. Ing Changfeng's lips twitched and a trace of darkness flashed across his eyes. Dominator of the sky, are you willing to participate in the universe in the sword? Do I have a choice? Nie Tian smiled faintly and asked. Of course. Ing Changfeng chuckled and said, Is a swordsman who doesn't even dare to enter the sword universe really qualified to be the Lord of the Sky? Nie Tian's eyes narrowed and his face darkened. He did not expect Ing Changfeng to be so straightforward. Ing Changfeng's words were very clear. If Nie Tian didn't enter the Cosmos Sword, the Qianquan sect would never recognize Nie Tian as the master of the sky. It was obvious that Ing Changfeng had planned everything. If Nie Tian were to enter the universe in the sword, that would be what he wanted to see the most. If Nie Tian didn't enter, he would lose face in front of all the swordsmen in the Qianquan sect. Then, his title as the Lord of the Sky would really be just a title. Even if he became stronger in the future, today's cowardice would be a shame that he would never be able to erase in his life. One had to admit that Ing Changfeng's intentions were extremely sinister. At that moment, the way the crowd looked at Nie Tian slowly changed. There was contempt, meaning, and sympathy in their eyes. Anyone who was slightly smarter could tell that the Cosmos Sword was a trap that Ing Changfeng had set for Nie Tian. Nie Tian had no choice but to jump into the trap. Otherwise, his title as the Lord of the Sky would only exist in name. So, Lord of the Sky, what's your answer? Ing Changfeng asked with a cold smile when he noticed that Nie Tian had not spoken for a long time. He was obviously impatient. At that moment, Ing Changfeng finally revealed his true self. He was like an actor who had removed his disguise and revealed his true self. Nie Tian. Ing Sangqiong called out to Nie Tian at that moment and shook his head continuously. It was obvious that he was reminding Nie Tian not to agree to it. Ing Sangqiong knew how terrifying the Cosmos Sword was. He did not want Nie Tian to be in danger. Who's my opponent? Nie Tian smiled faintly and asked Ing Changfeng in a deep voice. Nie Tian, you're the Lord of the Sky and a peerless sword principal genius recognized by the heart of the sky. The corner of Ing Changfeng's mouth twitched as he said with a smile, Your opponent must be the most outstanding disciple of the Qianquan sect. Zhu Zia? Or Ing Longshao? Nie Tian narrowed his eyes and asked directly. Zia Longshao. Ing Changfeng did not answer directly. Instead, the corner of his mouth twitched into a cold arc as he let out a strange laugh. Yes. Zhu Zia and Ing Longshao answered at the same time and took a step forward. They looked at each other before looking at Nie Tian and said in a loud voice, I wonder if we, the Qianquan sect, are qualified to be the Lord of the Sky's opponent if we join forces? Nie Tian looked at Zhu Zia and Ing Longshao. When he heard their words, his pupils involuntarily shrunk and his face instantly became incomparably gloomy. He never thought that Zhu Zia and Ing Longshao would actually join forces to fight against him. This. Everyone's expression also changed as they gasped one after another. They were speechless for a long time. In everyone's opinion, whether it was Zhu Zia or Ying Longshao, it was impossible for Nie Tian to win. After all, his strength was too weak. However, what Ying Changfeng did was to let Zhu Zia and Ying Longshao join forces to fight against Nie Tian alone. Ying Changfeng was really too sinister. On the surface, he raised Nie Tian's status so high, but in reality, he could not wait to kill him and use sinister methods to deal with him. Nie Tian smiled bitterly. His gaze swept across Ying Changfeng's body and could not help but shake his head. Who would have thought that the dignified Heaven and Earth Gate Master was actually so despicable? Moreover, he was despicable to the point of being righteous. Lord Master of the Sky, are you satisfied with the opponents that this Gate Master has arranged for you? Ying Changfeng smiled sinisterly and looked at Nie Tian from afar. Satisfied. Very satisfied. Nie Tian had a cold and solemn face as he laughed lowly twice. As long as you're satisfied. Ying Changfeng smiled faintly with a gloomy face. At this time, everyone looked at Nie Tian with blazing eyes. They were all guessing in their hearts whether Nie Tian would participate in the universe in the sword. Nie Tian. Ying Tsangqiong looked at Nie Tian and shouted again. He shook his head forcefully and did not let Nie Tian agree. Not participating in the universe in the sword would only be a matter of losing face. But participating in the universe in the sword would become a matter of life and death. Between the two, ordinary people could distinguish which was more important at a glance. However, Nie Tian remained silent for a long time before the corners of his mouth curled up into a smile. He looked at Ying Changfeng and said in a loud voice, "Since Lord Sectmaster has invited me with great hospitality, wouldn't it be a waste of Lord Sectmaster's good intentions if I don't attend? The universe in the sword is a battle between heaven and earth. I'll participate." The sonorous voice caused the entire place to fall into a dead silence. Everyone looked at Nie Tian in a daze and did not react for a long time. It was unbelievable that Nie Tian actually agreed to participate in the universe in the sword. Lord Master of the Sky is indeed bold. Ying Changfeng's eyes trembled with blazing excitement. He was also stunned for a long time before he reacted and laughed heartily. Chapter 36-27. The show has begun. Request? Ying Changfeng was startled for a moment before he smiled and said, "Master of the Sky, please speak." He was curious about what request Nie Tian would make. "I'm fighting Zhu Zia and Ying Longshao by myself. Don't you think it's unfair, Sect Master?" Nie Tian said loudly with a faint smile. Ying Changfeng frowned and his expression stiffened. He did not expect Nie Tian to care about this. He could not help but laugh and said, "Two against one, it's indeed unfair. Then let's do it this way. Master of the Sky, if any swordsman here has the honor to fight alongside the Master of the Sky, please invite him or her out." It didn't seem fair for Zhu Zia and Ying Longshao to join hands against Nie Tian. However, this was not the main point. The main point was that Zhu Zia and Ying Longshao were the most powerful among the younger generation of swordsmen in the Qiankuan sect. In other words, none of the remaining swordsmen could be Nie Tian's teammates. If he chose a weak swordsman, not only would he not be able to help Nie Tian, but he would also be a burden. If he had to choose a teammate from this group, Ying Tsangqiong would be a good choice. Who is willing to stand still and be my teammate? At this moment, Nie Tian smiled and swept his gaze across the crowd as he spoke loudly. However, wherever he looked, everyone lowered their heads. It was obvious that they did not want to be his teammate. Zhu Zia and Ying Longshao were too powerful. Under the current situation, whoever fought against Nie Tian would be courting death. Is there no one? The corner of Nie Tian's lips twitched. He smiled faintly and his eyes were filled with undisguised mockery. If he did not agree to participate in the universe in the sword, these swordsmen would definitely look down on him. However, he wanted to find a teammate now, but no one stood out. At this moment, every sentence that Nie Tian said was also a mockery to these swordsmen. Ing Sangqiong looked at Nie Tian with a serious expression. He was hesitating whether he should step forward or not. He wasn't afraid of death, but he was afraid of being a burden to Nie Tian. He knew that his sword intent was not as strong as Nie Tian's. When two swordsmen worked together, they had to be at least of equal strength to achieve the effect of 1 + 1 is greater than 2. Moreover, in the sword universe, the sword formation was very sensitive to the swordsman's sword intent. Ing Sangqiong's strength had skyrocketed not long ago, causing his control over his martial body and his own sword intent to decrease a lot. It was really difficult for him to cooperate with Nie Tian. Me. After hesitating for a long time, Ing Sangqiong stood out and said loudly. Even if his strength was inferior to Nie Tian's, he felt extremely honored to be able to fight alongside Nie Tian. Ing Sangqiong. Everyone couldn't help but be stunned when they heard Ing Sangqiong's voice. They looked over and exclaimed. No one had expected that Ing Sangqiong would actually stand out at this moment. Was he not afraid of death? Ing Changfeng also frowned at this moment. He was obviously a little unhappy. Ing Sangqiong was at least top 5 among the younger generation of swordsmen in the Qiankuan sect. It would be a pity if he participated in the sword universe with Nie Tian. However, it was nothing. Losing Ing Sangqiong in exchange for the thing in Nie Tian's body was worth it. Brother Ing, I'll remember your kindness today for the rest of my life. However, our sword intents don't match. Let the person behind you do it. Nie Tian looked at Ing Sangqiong and said with a smile. Ing Sangqiong frowned. He suddenly turned around and saw Lan Zhuying standing behind him. Let me do it. Lan Zhuying looked at Ing Sangqiong. Her beautiful eyes flickered and she smiled faintly. She was already prepared. She just didn't stand out. Her. Ing Changfeng looked at Lan Zhuying and couldn't help but be stunned. Then he smiled and said, The Lord of the Sky really has a good eye. You chose a sword spirit body. Ing Changfeng only carefully observed Lan Zhuying after Nie Tian chose her. Before that, he actually didn't realize that Lan Zhuying was an extremely rare sword spirit body. Of course, after him, a swordsman with a sword spirit body had the sword intent of heaven and earth in his bloodline. Even his entire martial body was filled with the sword intent of heaven and earth. And a swordsman with a sword spirit body had the sword intent of heaven and earth. The sword universe was also filled with the sword intent of heaven and earth. A swordsman with a sword spirit body, in the sword universe, under the same level of sword intent, would be able to stimulate the power of the sword formation by several times more than a normal swordsman. What worried Ing Changfeng even more was that although Lan Zhuying was young, her swordsmanship had already reached the second heaven of the Oracle realm. A sword spirit martial artist at such a realm might bring some different variables to this heaven and earth showdown. She's my friend. I can choose her, right? Nie Tian asked calmly with a faint smile. Of course. Ing Changfeng smiled stiffly. He just said that Nie Tian could choose any swordsman present, including Lan Zhuying. If he went back on his words, it would be like slapping himself in the face. Okay. Nie Tian nodded with a casual smile on his face. The reason why he chose Lan Zhuying was that she had a sword spirit body. Lan Zhuying would be the key to his victory in this heaven and earth showdown. Since that's the case, let's begin. Ing Changfeng looked at Nie Tian and let out a faint smile. His eyes shone with a cold light. Even if Nie Tian had the help of the sword spirit body, he absolutely did not believe that Nie Tian could win this heaven and earth showdown. Nie Tian nodded slightly and then looked at Lan Zhuying. The two moved at the same time and directly stepped into the sword in the universe. Their figures appeared in the Kuan sword. At the same time, Zhu Zia and Ing Longshao appeared in the Qian sword. The heaven and earth showdown, the battle of heaven and earth. The four people would use the Qian sword and the Kuan sword as their weapons to carry out a cruel showdown. Boom! Boom! At the moment when the four people landed, the Qian Kuan double swords sensed a strong sword essence aura and suddenly shook in the void, releasing two boundless sword essence aura. Two ripples of sword essence appeared between heaven and earth, sweeping in all directions with great power. What a strong aura! Everyone's eyes suddenly trembled and their expressions changed at the same time. They could not help but exclaim. They did not expect that the sword essence aura released by the Qian Kuan double swords would be so terrifying. The stronger the sword essence aura of the Qian Kuan double swords, the stronger the sword essence of Nie Tian and the other three people. The show is about to start. Ying Changfeng stood high in the sky and looked at Nie Tian and the others. The corner of his mouth twitched and his face darkened. It was the first time that Nie Tian and Lan Zhuiying had entered the universe in the sword, so they were completely unfamiliar with the surrounding formation aura. They needed some time to adapt to the sword formation power of the Kuan sword. Chapter 36-28. Chapter 36-23. Battle of Heaven and Earth. Boom! Ying Longxiao's sword will was released wildly. The giant Qian sword soared into the sky like a giant dragon. A terrifying sword aura was released and the brilliance of the sword surged tens of thousands of meters away. The heaven and earth trembled as if it was about to collapse. Nie Tian's eyes narrowed slightly. He didn't expect Ying Longxiao to attack directly. It seemed that Ying Longxiao was very familiar with the universe in the sword. He must have trained for a long time in advance. Ying Changfeng was despicable to this extent. Since he had already decided to let Ying Longxiao participate in the universe duel, it was not strange for him to familiarize himself with the universe in the sword in advance. Boom! At this moment, after the Qian sword soared into the sky, it suddenly swooped down and directly attacked the Kuan sword. Watch out! Lan Zhuiying's expression suddenly changed. Her beautiful eyes couldn't help but tremble as she screamed. She could feel the terrifying impact of the sword aura in the Kuan sword. She didn't expect the battle of the universe in the sword to be so terrifying. Nie Tian's eyes narrowed and his face instantly became tense. Then, the sword will surged wildly from his body and attacked the Kuan sword. Boom! In the next moment, the Kuan sword sensed something and soared into the sky. The heaven and earth shook and the clouds changed color. It was extremely terrifying. Ying Changfeng's expression suddenly changed when he saw this. He couldn't help but exclaim in his heart. He couldn't believe his eyes. Nie Tian had just entered the Kuan sword and he could actually activate the Kuan sword with his sword will. Under normal circumstances, even a monstrous swordsman would need a long time to adapt and activate the Qian sword or the Kuan sword. However, Nie Tian could directly activate the Kuan sword with his sword will. It was too terrifying. As for Ying Longxiao, he had already adapted to the universe in the sword in advance, so he could activate the Qian sword immediately. Even Zhu Zia couldn't directly activate the Qian sword and could only move along with Ying Longxiao. Boom! In the next moment, the two swords collided with a terrifying sound in the void. The heaven and earth were solemn because of it. Then, an incomparably powerful force was released and rushed in all directions. It was like a surging wave, stirring up the heaven and earth, as if it was going to annihilate everything. The crowd looked at the two sword shadows in the sky with trembling eyes and retreated. No one had expected that the battle would break out in an instant, and that it would be so intense. Boom! At that moment, an explosive rumble rang out. The Kuan sword was like a huge beast, flying tens of thousands of meters away in the void. Tremendous sword chi swept through everything, and the world seemed like it was going to collapse. Pooh! Almost at the same time, Nie Tian and Lan Zhuiying's bodies trembled at the same time. They spat out a mouthful of blood, and their faces became extremely pale. Nie Tian forcibly stabilized his body. The sword intent around him continued to be released, and only then did he stabilize the Kuan sword. In the next moment, Nie Tian frowned and looked at Lan Zhuing, asking nervously, "Lan Zhuing, are you alright?" In the next battle, he still needed Lan Zhuing's help. If the latter were to be seriously injured now, it would be terrible. Lan Zhuing took a deep breath, and the blood at the corner of her mouth disappeared. Her complexion improved a little as she nodded and said, "I'm fine." Nie Tian sensed that Lan Zhuing's aura was very stable, so he was relieved. At that moment, he looked at Zhu Zia and Ying Longshao, who were in the Qian sword. His eyes were extremely gloomy, like a ferocious beast. The moment just now was too dangerous. Fortunately, it was only Ying Longshao who attacked. If Ying Longshao and Zhu Zia attacked at the same time and activated the Qian sword, it would be terrible. Ying Longshao alone activated the Qian sword, and it already had such power. If Zhu Zia's power was added, then it was extremely likely that Nie Tian and Lan Zhuing would be killed. "Nie Tian, you're dead." At that moment, Ying Longxiao's eyes turned cold, and a cold light surged out of his eyes. It was like a sharp blade, extremely cold. Boom! In the next moment, his entire body's sword aura was released again, and it crashed into the Qian sword. Suddenly, the Qian sword danced in the air, and the space within hundreds of thousands of meters was filled with an extremely terrifying sword aura. Ying Longxiao's murderous intent towards Nie Tian was extremely strong, and it was as if he wanted to kill Nie Tian with a single strike. However, Zhu Zia, who was beside him, had an ugly expression on his face. As Qianya, he was known as the #1 genius of the Qiankuan sect, but now Ying Longshao had the initiative, and he could only passively cooperate. This situation made him very dissatisfied. However, even if he was dissatisfied, he could only hold it in for now. He had to cooperate with Ying Longshao to defeat Nie Tian. This was the death order that Ying Changfeng had given him and Ying Longshao. Therefore, this Qiankuan battle wasn't just a battle of sword aura, but also a battle of life and death for him and Ying Longshao. "Nie Tian, he's coming again," Lan Zhuing exclaimed as she sensed the enormous pressure coming from the Qian sword. Her beautiful eyes trembled with fear. "Follow my sword aura." Nie Tian frowned, but he didn't look too flustered as he said in a deep voice. In the next moment, Nie Tian's sword aura surged out of his body, turning into sword shadows that crashed into the Kuan sword. Instantly, the Kuan sword was stimulated, and it began to release a terrifying sword aura. Lan Zhuing's beautiful eyes flickered as she felt the surging sword aura from Nie Tian. She began to release her own sword aura, cooperating with Nie Tian to activate the power of the Kuan sword. Boom! Then, the Kuan sword was like a wild dragon, crazily rolling and crashing into the void, exploding with a terrifying sword aura. Boom! Boom! High up in the sky, the two sword shadows were like two giant beasts, crazily attacking as if they had the power to destroy everything. Bang! In the next instant, the two swords clashed against each other, and the sound of metal colliding rang out in the air. After that, a terrifying shockwave spread out in all directions. Everywhere the shockwave passed by, the heavens and earth trembled, as though doomsday had arrived. The crowd retreated again, unable to withstand the impact of the collision of the two swords. Swordsmen were in the cosmos of the sword. After their sword aura passed through the sword matrix, their sword aura would be greatly enhanced. Therefore, at this moment, the battle between the two swords was more intense than the battle between Saint Tianyi and the warrior. At this moment, the two sword shadows clashed in the void, neither giving way to the other. They were like two giant beasts wrestling with each other. Die! At this moment, Ying Longshao growled, and the sword aura all over his body exploded. Suddenly, the aura of the Kuan sword skyrocketed. Bang! Then, there was a terrifying muffled sound in the void. The Kuan sword trembled in the air, then retreated thousands of meters, leaving a dazzling sword aura in the sky. Nie Tian and Lan Zhuing, who were in the Kuan sword, also suffered a terrifying impact. Their bodies trembled and they vomited blood again. Damn it! Nye Tian growled, and his eyes darkened. With a thought, the sword aura all over his body began to explode wildly, and the sword aura was as violent as a landslide. At this moment, he directly activated the sacred spirit of sky evolution. Archean sacred spirit. High up in the sky, Ing Chongfeng's eyes were burning with excitement when he saw this, and he almost screamed. Chapter 36:29. Extreme shamelessness. High up in the sky, Ing Chongfeng saw Nye Tian use the Archean Saint Soul, and the sword momentum of his body rose violently, but he was not nervous at all. Instead, his eyes were trembling with excitement, revealing a sense of fanaticism. He wanted to see Nye Tian use the Archean Saint Soul. Boom! At the moment when Nye Tian activated the Archean Saint Soul, the sword intent in his body was extremely violent and terrifying. Then, under the stimulation of the sword intent, the momentum of the Kuan sword skyrocketed. The terrible sword momentum burst out and hit the void, as if it was going to tear the world apart. What a strong aura! The crowd, who was more than 100,000 meters away, could feel the fluctuation of the sword intent coming from the sky. They could not help but tremble, and the shock in their hearts could not be any greater. Who would have thought that Nye Tian would burst out such a terrible sword intent in an instant? Boom! In the next moment, the Qiankuan dual swords collided with each other, and suddenly there was a roar in the void. Then, an extremely powerful and shocking momentum was released, like a rolling wave, as if to drown the whole world. Boom! Between heaven and earth, the violent impact was endless, and it was a scene of doomsday. In the middle of the most tragic collision, even time and space were twisted. Boom! After a while, a terrible muffled sound was heard, and the Qiankuan dual swords trembled in the void at the same time, then immediately separated, and there was a distance of tens of thousands of meters between them. Buzz! In the void, a deafening sound of the sword rang out, and the cry of a crane could be heard for a long time. The eyes of the crowd trembled, and they were stunned by the scene in front of them. In this Qiankuan duel, the strength of both sides was obviously not strong, but the intensity of the battle was far beyond everyone's expectations. In particular, the power that Nye Tian burst out was too terrifying. Damn it! Inside the Qiankuan sword, Ing Longshao was like a wild beast. He roared, and his hair flew in the void, as if he had gone mad. In the collision just now, Nye Tian was not at a disadvantage at all, and even used the power of the Kuan sword to suppress his Qiankuan sword. He had never dreamed that Nye Tian would be able to adapt to the Kuan sword so quickly. Previously, it had taken him 4 or 5 days to truly grasp the method to activate the Qian sword. As for Nye Tian, he didn't need to use any time at all. As soon as he entered the Kuan sword, he could directly activate its power. By now, the power that Nye Tian could unleash from the Kuan sword was no less than his own. After activating the primordial twin souls, Nye Tian's sword Dao strength far surpassed Ing Longshao's. It wasn't strange that the Kuan sword could suppress the Qian sword. Idiot! At this time, Zhu Zia let out a low roar and said coldly, "If you don't want to lose, then let me control the Qian sword." Ing Longshao's face suddenly darkened and became extremely ugly. His pair of eyes gloomily looked at Zhu Zia, clearly very angry. In the Qiankuan gate, he had always been suppressed by Zhu Zia. No matter when people talked about geniuses of the Qiankuan sword, the first name they mentioned would always be Zhu Zia, followed by Ing Longshao. Ing Longshao's own strength was indeed inferior to Zhu Zia's, but he wasn't convinced. This time, he had the opportunity to enter the Qiankuan sword in advance to cultivate and familiarize himself with the Qiankuan sword in advance. He originally thought that he could occupy the dominant position and kill Nye Tian in one move. If that was the case, not only would he truly suppress Zhu Zia in front of everyone, but he would also be able to absorb Nye Tian's sword intent through the Qian sword. In the future, with the improvement that Nye Tian's sword intent brought to him, He would no longer be weaker than Zhu Zia. In the future, when people talked about the Qiankuan sword, the first person they would think of would be him, Ying Longshao. However, his thinking was too simple. Nie Tian's adaptation to the Kuan sword far exceeded his expectations. At this time, even if he used his full strength, he wouldn't be able to pose a threat to Nie Tian. Just as Zhu Zia said, if Ying Longshao continued to control the Qian sword, then this pair of Qiankuan swordsmen would most likely lose this Qiankuan battle. Ying Longshao, if you don't want to die, then get out of my way. Zhu Zia saw that Ying Longshao was still hesitating and immediately roared. Ying Longshao's gaze trembled as he suppressed the terrifying anger in his heart. However, after a moment, he still gave way to Zhu Zia. He knew that Zhu Zia's strength was stronger than his. Especially after Zhu Zia came out of seclusion, his sword Dao's strength had increased tremendously. At the same time, within the Kuan sword, Nie Tian stabilized his body. His eyes were bloodshot and beads of sweat oozed from his forehead. His expression was very ugly. Nie Tian, what's wrong? Lan Zhuying saw Nie Tian's appearance, and her beautiful eyes flickered as she asked nervously. In the exchange just now, the Kuan sword had the upper hand. Why did Nie Tian look like he was seriously injured? I'm fine. Nie Tian's face was gloomy as he waved his hand. However, his face became even uglier. It was as pale as a sheet, and his entire body looked like it was enduring an incomparably huge pressure. Indeed, at the moment, he was enduring an unimaginably huge sword pressure. Just now, when he activated the primordial twin souls, the Kuan sword released a terrifying sword pressure that pressed down from all directions. It was like an invisible giant hand that pressed down on him, making it hard for him to breathe. Nie Tian was very puzzled. Why would such a terrifying sword pressure be triggered after activating the primordial sacred souls? Despicable! At this moment, the Ghost Emperor's voice suddenly rang out. The Kuan sword has been tampered with. What do you mean? Nie Tian's eyes trembled as he exclaimed in horror. The Kuan sword's runes have been imbued with a curse power. It has a special ability to sense the primordial sacred souls. Therefore, after you activated the primordial sacred souls, you felt the surrounding sword pressure skyrocket. The Ghost Emperor's eyes trembled slightly. Through the fluctuations of the surrounding aura, he could sense the terrifying sword pressure Nie Tian was enduring at the moment. Fortunately, Nie Tian's martial body was strong. Otherwise, he would have been directly suppressed to death. Shameless! Nie Tian's eyes suddenly narrowed as he roared furiously. Of course, he knew that Ying Changfeng must have tampered with the Kuan sword. Back when he fought with Ying Longshao, he had used the primordial twin souls. Ying Changfeng had been secretly watching the battle, so it was not surprising that he knew he had the primordial twin souls. In fact, Nie Tian even felt that Ying Changfeng had designed the Cosmos sword for his primordial twin souls. Nie Tian, how long can you last under such terrifying sword pressure? Ying Changfeng's eyes trembled as he stared at Nie Tian from high up in the sky and said gloomily. The curse power in the Kuan sword was set up in advance to target Nie Tian's primordial twin souls. At this moment, Nie Tian's body suddenly trembled as he spat out a mouthful of blood. His face became extremely pale. Chapter 36:30. Resonance of Heaven and Earth. Nie Tian. Lan Zhuying exclaimed when she saw Nie Tian suddenly vomiting blood. She didn't sense anything out of the ordinary and didn't know what was happening to Nie Tian. The sword pressure produced by the curse only targeted the immemorial sacred soul, so Lan Zhuying naturally couldn't sense it. Damn it! Nie Tian's eyes were bloodshot as he growled. His entire body was drenched in cold sweat and his face was drained of blood. He felt that the sword pressure was becoming more and more terrifying. It made his entire body feel like it was being torn apart. It was as if there were countless sharp blades inside his body that were slowly tearing it apart. What's going on? Everyone looked at Nie Tian from afar, unsure of what was happening to him. Nie Tian can't hold on any longer? Ying Changfeng looked at Nie Tian from afar with a ferocious smile on his face, revealing a twisted sense of pleasure. Good chance. At this moment, Zhu Zia was gradually familiarizing himself with the Qian sword. When he saw Nie Tian suddenly vomiting blood, his eyes lit up and he let out a low roar. Then, sword intent erupted from his body and rushed towards the Qian sword. Kill him! At the same time, Ying Longshao roared. Sword intent surged out from his body and cooperated with Ying Longshao to activate the power of the Qian sword. Boom! In an instant, the Qian sword exploded with a terrifying sword aura. The sword radiance surged in the void and spread in all directions, forming a sea of sword radiance. The sharp and powerful sword intent impacted the void, causing the surrounding time and space to tremble. Kill! In the next instant, Zhu Zia and Ying Longshao roared at the same time. The Qian sword slashed across the void, and wherever the sword radiance passed, heaven and earth would be torn apart. Boom! Then, the Qian sword swooped down like a raging dragon. Instantly, a boundlessly powerful force of the sword formation erupted and blasted the Kuan sword. So powerful! The eyes of the crowd trembled, and they could not help but cry out. Their eyes were blazing, as if they could already see the scene of the Kuan sword being directly smashed. Nie Tian, you're dead for sure. Ying Longxiao's eyes trembled, and he actually laughed maniacally. He was certain that Nie Tian would definitely not be able to withstand this strike. Within the Kuan sword, Nie Tian's face was as pale as a sheet. He was panting heavily, and he seemed to be in a sorry state. Nie Tian. Lan Zhuying's beautiful eyes trembled with terror as she gazed at Qian Jian that was pouncing over ferociously, and she cried out anxiously. Activate your sword spirit body and cooperate with me. Nie Tian's eyes flickered slightly. He took a deep breath and forcefully stabilized his body, before unleashing his primordial twin souls once again. Streams of ferocious sword intent burst out from his body. Boom! 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 In the next moment, streams of sword intent circulated in the void, and in an instant, they formed 9 sword intent vortexes in 9 different locations. Lan Zhuying's beautiful eyes trembled. She was extremely intelligent, and she immediately understood that these 9 sword intent vortexes were the unique positions of the Kuan sword. When the sword intent struck those positions, it could erupt with even more power. Boom! In the next moment, Lan Zhuying's eyes trembled slightly, and she activated the Eye of the Sword Spirit. Instantly, all the sword intent in her body surged out in a frenzy, and it charged towards the 9 sword intent vortexes. Boom! 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 Subsequently, the 9 sword intent vortexes erupted like volcanoes after being impacted by the sword intent. Streams of terrifying sword formation energy were released in a frenzy, and it spread out like a tsunami. Buzz! Subsequently, the Kuan sword was stimulated, and the sword formation energy was released once again. The entire sword trembled in the void, and a clear sword cry resounded. After that, layers of sword rays appeared, and countless ripples of sword intent appeared in the air. It was extremely beautiful. What's going on? Everyone was shocked by the scene in front of them and cried out in alarm. Some of the people present had seen the Qiankuan showdown before, but they had never seen a scene like this. It seemed that the Kuan sword had unleashed extraordinary power under the stimulation of Nie Tian and Lan Zhuying. How is this possible? High up in the sky, Ying Changfeng's eyes narrowed in shock. He could not believe his eyes, and his face stiffened. Never in his dreams would he have thought that Nie Tian and Lan Zhuying would actually cause the universe to resonate. The resonance of the universe referred to the fusion of the aura of the swordsman and the Qian sword or the Kuan sword. After obtaining the acknowledgement of the Qian sword or the Kuan sword, the resonance of the universe would occur. Under the resonance of the universe, the might of the Qian sword or the Kuan sword would increase by several times. Both Zhu Zia and Ing Longshao were similarly shocked by the scene in front of them. Their expressions could not help but change. Rumble! However, at this moment, the Qian Kuan dual swords collided, and an unprecedented strong collision erupted. Suddenly, the void shook, and at the center of the collision, a terrifying devouring sword intent spread out. The sword raised soared into the sky and turned into a raging force that seemed to tear and shatter the world. The eyes of the crowd trembled, and they could not help but tremble. They could not believe the scene in front of them. Boom, boom, boom. High up in the sky, the roaring sound continued, the violent sword intent, whistling extremely murderous roar, extremely terrifying. Bang! After a long time, a muffled sound was heard. The Qian Kuan dual swords separated again, and each retreated tens of thousands of meters away. Everyone's eyes trembled as they looked at the four people in the Qian Kuan dual swords. Zhu Zia and Ing Longshao were in the Qian sword. The former was covered in blood and his face was pale. The latter looked terrified, and there were several bloody wounds on his body. He was also seriously injured. Because Zhu Zia was the leader of the Qian sword, the impact he received was far greater than Ing Longshao, and his injuries were also more serious. They did not understand why Nie Tian and Lan Zhuying were so much stronger than the Qian sword. Their strength was clearly far inferior to theirs. Why was the Kuan sword so much stronger than the Qian sword? And in the Kuan sword, Lan Zhuying's delicate body trembled slightly. Her face was pale, and there was a trace of blood at the corner of her mouth. Nie Tian's situation was even worse. His body was covered in bloody wounds, and his body was dyed red. His face was twisted, and his eyes were as dark as the abyss. He looked extremely terrifying. However, Nie Tian was not injured by Zhu Zia and Ing Longshao, but by the Kuan sword. Just now, he had forcefully used the primordial sacred soul, causing the sword pressure on his body to increase by several times. At this moment, he had to activate the Godfiend body to barely withstand the sword pressure. Otherwise, he would have been crushed to death by the sword pressure. That moment just now was really very dangerous. The Ghost Emperor helped Nie Tian find the 9 major array positions of the Kuan sword. Then, Nie Tian used his own sword intent as a guide to let Lan Zhuying release the sword intent of the sword spirit body, which triggered the Qian Kuan sword resonance. Lan Zhuying was a sword spirit body, and the sword intent in her body was the sword intent of heaven and earth. It contained the Tao of heaven and earth. Her sword intent could stimulate the power of the Kuan sword several times. Because of this, the Qian Kuan sword resonance appeared. Otherwise, with the strength of Nie Tian and Lan Zhuying's sword Tao, they might not be able to fight against Zhu Zia alone, let alone the Qian Kuan dragon. The Qian Kuan resonance was the reason why Nie Tian chose Lan Zhuying as his teammate. Such a huge sword pressure actually did not force out the primordial sacred soul. High up in the sky, Ing Chongfeng's eyes were extremely cold and trembling. He was almost roaring. He had no choice but to admit that he underestimated Nie Tian too much. He never thought that under the sword pressure of the Kuan sword, Nie Tian could actually persist for so long. However, he did not think that Nie Tian could still hold on. Under the stimulation of the primordial twin souls, the sword pressure released by the Kuan sword would become greater and greater. Very soon, it would reach the point where even great sage Lord Tianyi powerhouses could not withstand it. Chapter 36-31. Chapter 36-26. Chapter 36-26 Forceful Absorption. Nie Tian, are you all right? Lan Zhuying asked nervously as she looked at Nie Tian, who was covered in blood from within the Kuan sword. She had used up almost all the sword intent in her body to trigger the resonance of Qian Kuan. She would not be of any help in the following battle. She still could not understand why Nie Tian was injured so badly. The Master of the Sky is too weak after all. He is not as strong as the Qian Kuan sword. Everyone frowned as they looked at Nie Tian within the Kuan sword. They could tell that Nie Tian's injuries were far worse than Zhu Zia and Ying Longxiao. Therefore, they assumed that Nie Tian's strength was below Zhu Zia and Ying Longxiao. However, they did not know that Nie Tian was not injured by Zhu Zia or Ying Longxiao, but by the curse power within the Kuan sword. I'm fine. Nie Tian's eyes were filled with killing intent and as deep as an abyss. He felt as if his martial body was about to explode, as if it was about to be torn apart. Nie Tian, you won't be able to take it if this goes on. Let's begin. The Ghost Emperor's deep voice was heard. Nie Tian's dark eyes nodded slightly. He had originally hoped to use Lan Zhuiying's sword spirit body to buy more time for him, but now he was the one who couldn't hold on any longer. Lan Zhuiying, enter the 9 extremities. Nie Tian looked at Lan Zhuiying and said in a deep voice. Nie Tian, what are you doing? Lan Zhuiying was stunned. She had a bad feeling about this. I don't know what will happen next. It's safer for you to stay in the 9 extremities. Nie Tian's eyes were dark as he said. Lan Zhuiying thought for a while and eventually decided to enter the 9 extremities. Her sword intent was almost exhausted. Even if she continued to stay by Nie Tian's side, it would be useless. She might even become a burden to Nie Tian. Then let's begin. After Lan Zhuiying entered the 9 superbs, Nie Tian suddenly raised his head and looked cold at Ying Changfeng, who was high up in the sky. The corner of his mouth pulled into a strange smile, which made him look very evil. When Ying Changfeng realized that Nie Tian was looking at him, he could not help but narrow his eyes and freeze for a moment. Vaguely, he had an ominous premonition. It seemed that Nie Tian was plotting something. Lulu, it's time for you to perform. At this moment, Nie Tian smiled faintly and said in a deep voice. I can't wait any longer. Lulu, who hadn't appeared for a long time, chuckled. Then, the Saint's soul blood seal on Nie Tian's forehead trembled. Rays of white halos spread out, forming white ripples in the void. Then, the entire Kuan sword suddenly trembled. Suddenly, the surrounding void began to tremble violently as if it was about to collapse. Boom boom boom. In the next moment, the sword intent in the Kuan sword suddenly became active. Then, it began to flow crazily and poured into the Saint's soul blood seal. Zhu Zia and Ying Longxiao's eyes trembled violently when they saw this scene. They couldn't believe their eyes. Nie Tian was actually directly absorbing the sword intent in the Kuan sword. The sword intent in the Kuan sword was ferocious and violent. Nie Tian was only at the 8th level of heavenly charm. How could he withstand such a terrifying power? Is this guy crazy? Ying Changfeng, who was high up in the sky, squinted his eyes and shouted in horror. He never thought that Nie Tian would do such a thing at this time. Not to mention Nie Tian, even Ying Changfeng couldn't withstand the power of forcibly absorbing the sword intent of the entire Kuan sword. However, Nie Tian seemed to be very calm at this time. It was as if he had already decided to do this before entering the Kuan sword. Boom boom boom. In the Kuan sword, Nie Tian's ears were roaring incessantly. The sword intent flowed crazily and poured into the Saint's soul blood seal. Nie Tian was like a black hole, crazily absorbing the sword intent. And his martial body was withstanding unimaginably terrifying pressure. At the same time, the clear sky sword in his hand shone brightly. Waves of incomparably vigorous sword intent aura surged, extremely huge. Indeed, Ying Changfeng and the others were right. With Nie Tian's martial body, it was impossible for him to withstand the power of the Kuan sword. Even the Saint's soul blood seal was far from being able to directly absorb the sword intent of the Kuan sword. However, Nie Tian had one thing on him that could withstand the sword intent of the Kuan sword, and that was the sky sword. The sky sword was engraved with sword patterns in the sky. It was an incomparably huge sword array. Although the Kuan sword was strong, it was far from enough compared to the sword array in the sky. At this moment, Nye Tian was only using the Saint Soul Blood Seal as a medium to absorb the sword intent of the Kuan sword and pour it into the Sky Sword. In this way, not only could he absorb the sword intent of the Kuan sword, but he could also stimulate the power of the sword array in the sky. At this time, Ing Changfeng could not help but feel puzzled when he saw that Nye Tian had absorbed a lot of sword intent but had no reaction. Then, he sensed that the aura on the Sky Sword had begun to change. He suddenly thought of something and his expression changed as he exclaimed, "Oh no!" He finally understood that Nye Tian wanted to use the power of the Kuan sword to stimulate the sword array in the sky. Damn it! Ing Changfeng growled when he sensed this. His entire being was like a berserk ferocious beast. He had never thought that Nye Tian would have such a method to absorb the sword intent of the Kuan sword. No, I can't let him absorb the power of the Kuan sword. Ing Changfeng's eyes trembled as he roared in his heart. If Nye Tian absorbed the power of the Kuan sword, it would be terrible. Zhu Zia, Ing Longshao, the battle is not over yet. The next moment, Ing Changfeng looked at the two people in the Qian sword cold. He could no longer care about anything else and growled. Zhu Zia and Ing Longshao's eyes narrowed as they reacted. Boom! The two of them looked at each other and their sword intent erupted crazily, attacking the Qian sword. Suddenly, a huge sword shadow released a boundless sword momentum. The void immediately trembled as if it was about to collapse. Kill! The next moment, Zhu Zia and Ing Longshao growled at the same time. The Qian sword streaked across the void, and a huge sword light appeared in the air. Like a waterfall of flowing light, it descended from the sky and pressed down on the Kuan sword. Boom! Suddenly, the air trembled from the pressure, and the surrounding space was suddenly pulled taut. It actually began to distort and flip around. Nye Tian's eyes narrowed slightly, but his expression did not change much. He activated the Holy Soul Blood Seal and absorbed the power of the Kuan sword even more violently. Waves of terrifying sword intent surged into the Sky Sword and activated the sword array in the Sky Sword. Bang! The next moment, the entire Kuan sword could no longer withstand it and collapsed. The remaining sword intent dissipated in the void. In the blink of an eye, Nye Tian had absorbed almost all the power of the Kuan sword. Chapter 36-32. The power of the sword formation. He used the sword formation in the sky to absorb the power of the Kuan sword and activate a small part of the sword formation on the Sky Sword. However, he could feel that the small part of the sword formation in the Sky Sword contained immense power. How is this possible? Everyone was stunned by the scene in front of them. The shock in their hearts was written all over their faces. No one had expected that something like this would happen. It seemed that Nye Tian had absorbed the Kuan sword directly. It was too strange. Boom! At this moment, the Qian sword in the void pressed down on Nye Tian like a giant dragon. A violent whistling sound was heard in the air, and the violent power was extremely ear-piercing. Nye Tian suddenly looked up at this moment and raised the Sky Sword in his hand slightly. Every move he made seemed to be the only one in the world. It was as if he was the ruler of this world. Boom! In the next moment, as a thought entered Nye Tian's mind, the clear Sky Sword surged with an unparalleled sword aura, which spread out in all directions. Immediately, an enormous sword formation appeared in the void, standing in the air like a giant. The shocking scene caused everyone's eyes to tremble, and they all sucked in a breath of cold air. Their faces were filled with disbelief. Who would have thought that after Nye Tian absorbed the power of the Kuan sword, he would release a sword formation that was even more terrifying than the Kuan sword? Boom! Right at this moment, Nye Tian took a step forward, and the sword formation around him emanated a strand of enormous force that caused the space in the surroundings to sink while the heavens and the earth trembled incessantly. What a terrifying power! Nye Tian's eyes trembled slightly and he exclaimed in surprise. He did not expect that after the power of the Kuan sword entered the Sky Sword, it could activate such a huge power of the sword formation. Bang! Next, the Qian sword collided with the sword formation in the air. Like two giant primordial beasts, a terrifying explosion rang out in the air. A terrifying shockwave appeared, crazily spreading out in all directions. It was as if a huge wave was about to destroy everything. Everyone felt the momentum that could devour the world. Their eyes trembled violently and they retreated again. Bang! In the next moment, an even more terrifying sound rang out. The Qian sword trembled in the air, and then it was sent flying over 100,000 meters away. Pooh! Inside the Qian sword, Zhu Zia and Ying Longshao didn't even have time to stabilize their bodies before they spat out blood. The two of them were horrified, and they forcefully released their sword intents to stabilize the Qian sword. However, at this moment, they saw that a huge crack had appeared on the Qian sword. It was several thousand meters long, and it seemed like it was going to shatter at the very next moment. The Qian sword collided head-on with Nie Tian's sword formation, but it was actually shaken to the point of almost collapsing. On the other hand, the sword formation outside Nie Tian's body suddenly operated, and waves of sword intent aura surged in the void like a mountain of sword intent. How is this possible? Zhu Zia and Ying Longxiao's expressions changed as they exclaimed in unison. They had already used all their strength to activate the Qian sword, yet they were still unable to contend against Nie Tian. What in the world did Nie Tian do to the Kuan sword? Everyone's eyes trembled, each pair of eyes staring at Nie Tian. No words were able to express the shock in their hearts at this moment. Nie Tian was virtually resisting the Qian Kunlong's teaming up with his power alone. Rumble! And right at this time, the Qian sword suddenly vibrated strangely. Following that, a surge of sword intent was released, and it actually directly enveloped Zhu Zia and Ying Longshao. The two people's faces changed in fright, and they cried out at the same time. Following that, an even more terrifying scene happened. That surge of sword intent imprisoned them and actually started to forcefully absorb their sword intent. At the same time, that crack on the Qian sword started to slowly heal. Nie Tian's brows furrowed, being stunned by the scene before him. The Qian sword was actually devouring Zhu Zia's and Ying Longxiao's sword intent to repair the crack. Everyone was similarly stunned by this bizarre scene and was speechless for a moment. Ying Changfeng stood tall in the sky with a gloomy expression. No one knew what he was thinking about. His original plan was to use the curse power in the Kuan sword to force out the two primordial holy souls in Nie Tian's body, then let Zhu Zia and Ying Longshao defeat Nie Tian. By the time Nie Tian's sword intent was pretty much devoured, the heart of the sky would be forced out. What he wanted was not just the two primordial holy souls. More importantly, it was the heart of the sky. Although he was the Heaven and Earth Gate Master, he was also a member of the 5 major factions. He knew the terror of the heart of the sky better than others. When he was young, he had once entered the Sky Sword Marshal, but he failed to fuse with the heart of the sky. Presently, Nie Tian fused with the heart of the sky and became the Lord of the Sky. If he could force out Nie Tian's heart of the sky, perhaps he could fuse with the heart of the sky. However, Ying Changfeng clearly underestimated Nie Tian. Everything that happened in front of him at this moment far exceeded his expectations. The Kuan sword was absorbed by Nie Tian. It seemed like the battle between heaven and earth no longer existed. Under normal circumstances, the Qian sword and the Kuan sword would devour the sword intent of the swordsman. After the Qian and Kuan confrontation, the Qian sword and the Kuan sword would eventually fuse together. Then, the victor would be able to absorb some of the sword intent in the Qian Kuan sword. But now, the Kuan sword was gone. The Qian and Kuan confrontation only existed in name. Nie Tianling stood in the sword array and looked at Zhu Zia and Ying Longshao in the Qian sword from afar. He did not expect the sword array to have such power. It almost shattered the Qian sword. However, the current him was not feeling good. He was enduring the pressure from the sword array in the sky, making his martial body nearly tear apart. Save me! At this time, Zhu Zia's eyes suddenly trembled and he shouted loudly. The Qian sword was frantically devouring his and Ying Longxiao's sword intent. It wouldn't be long before their sword Dao cultivation would be completely crippled. Nie Tian's eyes narrowed slightly. He could not help but look at Ying Changfeng in the sky. The latter's face was gloomy and he did not have the slightest reaction. It was as if he did not see Zhu Zia and Ying Longxiao at all. Nie Tian frowned. He never thought that he would have to devour Zhu Zia and Ying Longxiao's sword intent. He did not care about this at all. But now, Zhu Zia and Ying Longxiao were imprisoned by the Qian sword and were in an extremely dangerous situation. Save me! Zhu Zia's eyes trembled as he looked at Nie Tian from afar. He was almost begging. If Ying Changfeng did not make a move, the only person present who could save them was Nie Tian. Ying Longxiao also looked at Nie Tian. He no longer had the insolence from before. His eyes were surging with pain, despair, and begging. Boom! Nie Tian's eyes slightly darkened. He took a step forward and the void trembled. Then, the sword in the sky in his hand suddenly moved and the sword array changed. The endless power of the sword array condensed into a huge sword shadow in the void and suppressed the Qian sword. This! The crowd's eyes trembled and they could not help but exclaim. They thought that Nie Tian was going to kill Zhu Zia and Ying Longxiao. Chapter 36-33. Chapter 36-28. Chapter 36-28. Sky is out of control. High up in the sky, Ying Changfeng's eyes flickered with a cold light as he stared fixedly at Nie Tian with killing intent. However, he didn't make a move right away. Instead, he was observing. At this moment, the sword formation surrounding Nie Tian's body made him feel threatened. Hence, he had to wait for an opportunity. Don't kill me! At this moment, Zhu Zia and Ying Longxiao looked at the gigantic sword shadow descending from the sky. Their eyes trembled violently and they cried out at the same time. Their expressions were extremely shocked. Even though they were within the Qian sword, they could still feel the enormous pressure coming from the sword images. The destructive aura caused them to feel despair. The eyes of the crowd trembled. It seemed that when the sword shadow descended, it would be the moment Zhu Zia and Ying Longxiao would perish. Boom! In the next moment, the gigantic sword image crashed down like a mountain, directly descending upon the Qian sword. The space instantly trembled, and the heavens and the earth became solemn. In an instant, boundless waves of power erupted and spread madly in all directions. Rumble, rumble, rumble. Above the horizon, violent waves surged to the heavens. It was as if 10,000 demons were dancing wildly, as if they wanted to devour and annihilate everything. The crowd was pushed back once again. Boom! It was so much so that even the Universal Palace was affected by the pressure. It trembled for a moment, and it seemed as if it would collapse in the next moment. Break! At this moment, Nie Tian's eyes darkened slightly. With a low roar, the sword light formation above the sword in the sky suddenly erupted. Instantly, the sword light surged over 100,000 meters. Bang! After that, the enormous Qian sword trembled in space, and then it actually collapsed into pieces. It transformed into boundless waves of sword intent that were completely absorbed by the sword formation. The crowd was shocked by the scene in front of them, and they all exclaimed in surprise. Who would have thought that after Nie Tian used the power of the sword formation to shatter the Qian sword, the sword formation would actually absorb the Qian sword's sword intent? Bang! Bang! At this moment, two muffled sounds rang out as two silhouettes were sent flying backwards. They were none other than Zhu Zia and Ying Longxiao. The two of them retreated several thousand meters in the air before finally stabilizing themselves. They stood in the air with blank expressions on their faces. Nie Tian had shattered the Qian sword with a single sword strike, yet he hadn't injured them at all. At this moment, they had broken free from the shackles of the Qian sword, and their sword intent hadn't weakened at all. It's him. He saved us. Zhu Zia and Ing Longxiao's eyes trembled. They finally reacted and said in astonishment. They were indeed asking for help from Nie Tian, but they didn't expect that Nie Tian would actually save them. If Nie Tian didn't make a move, all of their sword intent would be devoured by the Qian sword. Even if they were lucky enough to survive, their cultivation in the sword Dao would be completely crippled. At this moment, Nie Tian stood high up in the sky. After absorbing the energy of the Qian sword, the sword formation around him expanded once more. A powerful and ferocious sword will gushed out in the void in the surroundings, causing the world to tremble endlessly as even time and space started to distort. Nie Tian's gaze suddenly focused while his expression became extremely unsightly. He noticed to his astonishment that after the sword formation absorbed the energy of the Qian sword, it actually showed signs of going out of control, and it seemed as if it was on the verge of losing control. Oh no! At this moment, the Ghost Emperor exclaimed in panic. Originally, after the sword in the sky absorbed the energy of the Kuan sword, the power of the sword formation skyrocketed. It was extremely difficult for Nie Tian to control this power. Now that the sword formation in the sky was activated and absorbed the energy of the Qian sword, Nie Tian was far from being able to control it. Damn it! Nie Tian growled. The hand that was gripping the sword in the sky was trembling non-stop, as if it would fall out of his hand at the next moment. The power of the sword formation after it erupted was simply too strong, and he couldn't control it at all. In the next moment, several cracks appeared on Nie Tian's arm. Blood gushed out, and his entire arm seemed like it was about to break. Nie Tian, let go! The Ghost Emperor yelled in panic. If Nie Tian continued to hold the sword in the sky, his martial body wouldn't be able to withstand it at all, and it was extremely likely that he would explode. I won't let go! Nie Tian's eyes trembled, but he let out a low roar. His pair of dark eyes looked extremely frightening. At this moment, he had a strong feeling that if he let go, he would never be able to hold the sword in the sky again. Buzz! At this moment, the sword in the sky suddenly trembled and let out a deep and powerful sword cry. Following this, a terrifying sword aura soared into the sky, causing the surrounding void to shake violently. Bang bang bang! In an instant, Nie Tian heard a cracking sound coming from within his body. It turned out that his bones and meridians had directly cracked under the impact of the sword in the sky. Nie Tian, let go! The Ghost Emperor's eyes narrowed in horror as he shouted, "You will die!" The power of the sword formation in the sky was too strong. If Nie Tian didn't let go, he might really be killed by it. I am the Lord of the Sky, I will never let go. Nie Tian's body was in extreme pain, but his eyes were like the most terrifying abyss, extremely gloomy. Both of his hands held the sword in the sky tightly, not letting go at all. Nie Tian, are you crazy? The Ghost Emperor roared when he saw this scene. Nie Tian was like a madman, completely reckless. Most importantly, the Ghost Emperor didn't understand why Nie Tian was so persistent. Rumble! 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 At this moment, a terrifying sword aura appeared and spread in all directions. Everywhere it passed, even time and space were twisted. It was extremely terrifying. The sky and earth were extremely gloomy, as if it was about to collapse. What's going on? Everyone retreated once again, countless eyes fixed on Nie Tian from afar, the shock in their hearts to the extreme. They didn't understand what was going on. It seemed that the huge sword formation around Nie Tian's body was out of control. The sky is out of control. This is my chance. Ing Changfeng looked at Nie Tian from high up in the sky. His eyes were burning with excitement. Of course, He could tell that the sky sword in Nye Tian's hand had gone out of control because it had absorbed too much power. Nye Tian was too weak to control the sky sword. If Nye Tian let go of the sky sword now, Ing Changfeng would definitely pick up the sky sword without hesitation. As long as he could subdue the sky sword, it would be easy for him to merge with the heart of the sky. Everything went better than Ing Changfeng had expected. Ah! Right at this moment, Nye Tian suddenly threw his head back and let out a miserable howl. Under the impact of the clear sky sword, the skin and flesh on both of his arms were lacerated. On his arms, white bones were directly exposed, and on the white bones there were actually numerous cracks. The power of the sky sword was so terrifying that it shattered Nye Tian's skin and flesh and cracked his bones and meridians. Gasp! The crowd gasped when they saw this scene. They were all dumbfounded. It was hard to imagine what kind of pain Nye Tian was suffering at this moment. However, Nye Tian's pair of skeletal hands still did not loosen its grip. Like an iron pincer, it tightly held onto the clear sky sword. Chapter 36-34. Sword's Disaster Master. The crowd suddenly felt a terrifying fluctuation of sword essence. They looked up and saw Ing Changfeng's figure. They couldn't help but tremble and scream. Ing Changfeng suddenly attacked. What was he going to do? Nye Tian, let go. Floating in midair, Ing Changfeng let out a bellow. Then, his body shook, and a strand of sword intent was unleashed. With a loud whistle, it condensed into a blade of killing intent and slashed towards Nye Tian. Nye Tian felt a chill. He looked up and his eyes couldn't help but tremble. He didn't expect Ing Changfeng to be so shameless as to attack him at this time. Impossible! Nye Tian's eyes flickered with an incomparably determined light. He let out an explosive roar as he raised his hands and slashed the clear heaven sword across the sky. A sword light that was tens of thousands of meters long blossomed, causing the surrounding void to tremble. Boom! In the next instant, the sword formation in the sky released a huge sword essence. A sword shadow appeared in the sky. It was as huge as a giant beast with an incomparably majestic momentum and directly pressed down on Ing Changfeng. Ing Changfeng felt the sword pressure coming toward him. His eyes trembled and he couldn't help but exclaim in surprise. He didn't expect Nye Tian to be able to control the sword formation to resist under such circumstances. Nye Tian's strength wasn't strong enough to threaten him at all. However, the sword formation in the sky was very terrifying and was enough to pose a threat to Ing Changfeng. Ing Changfeng's expression changed slightly. A long sword appeared in his hand and he slashed with it. A huge sword shadow appeared in the void and actually emitted the sound of monstrous waves. The sword shadow was like a wild wave that carried the momentum of a storm and resisted the pressure of the sword formation. Boom! As the sword formation fell, the void suddenly sank and the world seemed to collapse. Suddenly, the sword essence spread in all directions and wreaked havoc between heaven and earth. Ing Changfeng's figure moved and he retreated thousands of meters. After he stabilized his body, there was a trace of blood at the corner of his mouth and his face was gloomy. He did not expect that the power of the sword that Nye Tian released through the sword formation would be so terrifying. He used the sword of Yuan spirit and used all his strength, but he was only barely able to block it. In that instant just now, if his reaction had been slightly slower, he would have been killed by the power of the sword formation. The crowd was shocked by the scene in the sky, and they all cried out in surprise. Who would have thought that Ing Changfeng, the Qiankuan gate master, would actually be repelled by Nye Tian with a single sword strike? However, Nye Tian's situation was getting worse. His skin and flesh began to disintegrate bit by bit along his arms. All the bones and meridians in his body were ruptured. His entire body was on the verge of collapse, like a broken leaf in a storm. Nye Tian, you can't hold on any longer. Let go. The Ghost Emperor's voice rang out again. Nye Tian's eyes flickered, but he did not let go. Instead, his body shook as the 9 heavenly shackles in his body were unleashed. They turned into heavenly runes that were engraved on his body like a brand. Lunatic! The Ghost Emperor's eyes darkened as he let out a roar. Nyetian was too crazy. He had used the power of the heavenly shackles to forcibly stabilize his body. Although such a clumsy method could temporarily support his martial physique, it multiplied the pain he had to endure. Ah! Nyetian's entire body was in extreme pain. He let out a roar and looked like a ferocious beast. Nyetian, I'd like to see how long you can hold on. Ing Changfeng glared at Nyetian with a murderous look in his eyes. He no longer concealed his emotions. The long-wind sword in his hand slashed across the sky and executed the 7 ultimate waves breaker once again. A terrifying sword aura was emitted as the sword swept across, causing time and space to distort. A vortex of sword intent appeared wherever the sword passed. Boom! In the next instant, the vortex of sword intent moved and pressed down on Nyetian. The exploding sword aura seemed like it was going to tear the earth and sky apart. Suddenly, a terrifying aura of sword intent surged and filled the space within hundreds of thousands of meters. Ing Changfeng's eyes were filled with killing intent. Since he had already made his move, he had to kill Nyetian and obtain the heart of the sky. Has Lord Sect Master gone mad? Everyone looked at Ing Changfeng with trembling eyes. They could not believe that Ing Changfeng would dare to kill Nyetian in front of so many people. In any case, even if Ing Changfeng did not admit it, Nyetian was still the master of the sky. If Nyetian were to die in Ing Changfeng's hands, would the other 4 factions let it go so easily? Ing Changfeng's current actions were simply digging a grave for the Qiankuan sect. However, Ing Changfeng had almost lost his mind for the sake of the heart of the sky. He was attacking crazily and recklessly. At that moment, he only had eyes for the heart of the sky. Although he was the Qiankuan sect leader, the Qiankuan sect was nothing in his eyes. If he killed Nyetian and incurred the wrath of the other 4 factions, he could just leave the Qiankuan sect. The all-heaven sacred world was so huge. Even if the 4 factions joined forces, they would not be able to find him easily. However, once he obtained the heart of the sky, his future achievements would definitely be limitless. Ing Changfeng was attacking completely for his own sake. He did not care about the life and death of the Qiankuan sect at all. Boom! At that moment, a huge sword shadow appeared high in the sky. It was like a huge wave, and the sound of surging waves could be heard in the void. In the blink of an eye, the terrifying sword aura descended. The void seemed to freeze as it actually paused for a moment. Nyetian's eyes suddenly darkened, and his expression changed. He felt an almost suffocating pressure in the sword formation. As the Qiankuan sect leader, Ing Changfeng's strength was extremely terrifying. His martial cultivation had reached the peak of the Zongyun sacred world, the 9th level of heavenly righteousness. His sword Dao had reached the sword heavenly tribulation realm, the 9th level. The sage realm sword Dao had 6 major realms: sword rhythm, oracle, sacred meaning, sword heavenly tribulation, sword sense god-defying, and sword martial saint. The Zongyun sacred world was a mid-level sacred world. Warriors were restricted by the world's level, and the 9th level of heavenly righteousness great sage was the limit. However, the suppression of the world's level on the sword Dao was far lower than the suppression on the martial Dao. Therefore, Ing Changfeng's sword Dao could reach the shocking 9th level of sword heavenly tribulation realm. Among the sage realm's 6 sword Daos, the first 3 were the mortal sage swords, and the last 3 were the exalted sage swords. Ing Changfeng's 9th level of sword heavenly tribulation realm was extremely terrifying. It was no exaggeration to say that his sword Dao cultivation was enough to face a heavenly tribulation sage expert head-on. At that moment, Ing Changfeng had made up his mind to kill. He no longer held back against Nyetian and attacked with all his might. The sword Heavenly Tribulation Swordsman contained the power of heavenly tribulation in every sword intent. It was a kind of tribulation power of heaven and earth, and it was extremely oppressive to warriors who were slightly weaker. Kill! At that moment, Nye Tian's eyes darkened slightly. Without any fear, he let out a low roar. A pair of skeletal hands covered in heavenly Tao runes suddenly rose, and the sky sword let out a low sword hum in the air. Chapter 36-35. The Power of Heavenly Tribulation. Kill! Nye Tian let out a low roar and slashed down with the sword in the sky. The power of the sword formation was forcibly activated and a vast and unparalleled sword momentum was released. It was violent, overbearing, and extremely terrifying. Boom! The monstrous aura of the sword intent surged in the void and revealed a devouring aura. It was like a mad beast that suddenly became angry and seemed to want to devour everything in front of it. The sword formation in the sky absorbed the power of heaven and earth in the sword, and the Qianquan dual swords contained extremely terrifying devouring power. Therefore, it was not surprising that the sword intent contained the devouring power. The crowd shouted at the huge sword shadow in the sky. Their eyes were trembling and their faces were filled with disbelief. They could not believe that Nye Tian could burst out such a terrifying power. Nye Tian was clearly unable to control the sword formation before. At this moment, he could forcibly suppress the martial body and activate the power of the sword formation. This terrifying willpower was too abnormal. Boom! At this moment, the two sword shadows in the void collided with each other. It was like two giant beasts from ancient times. Heaven and earth trembled and the sword will surged endlessly in all directions, as if it wanted to engulf the world. Boom, boom, boom. Above the sky, the rumbling sound was endless. The endless waves turned into a terrifying impact, causing the surrounding space to become distorted. Countless space-time turbulence appeared in the sky. The sword intent and devouring aura filled the space between heaven and earth. It was extremely violent. Bang! After a long time, a shocking explosion was heard. Then, the two sword shadows trembled at the same time and directly collapsed. Rumble! Suddenly, endless waves of sword will spread out like a stormy sea, tumbling endlessly and blasting everything in its path. The crowd had retreated hundreds of thousands of meters away, but they could still feel the violent aura that covered the earth. It was extremely terrifying, as if it could annihilate everything. At this moment, Ying Changfeng's figure flew backward and drew a line of blood in the void. When he stabilized his body, his entire body was dripping with blood. His eyes were like those of a fierce beast, flickering with greed and unconcealable fear. He couldn't imagine how Nye Tian could erupt with such terrifying power. With the help of the sword array in the sky, Nye Tian was able to fight against him, the leader of the Qianquan Gate. However, at this time, Nye Tian was similarly suffering, and his injuries were even more severe than Ying Changfeng's. Ying Changfeng's sword contained the terrifying power of the heavenly tribulation. The sword intent seeped into Nye Tian's martial body through the sword array, filling his flesh, meridians, and bones with the violent power of the heavenly tribulation. Coupled with the terrifying pressure from the sky sword, the pressure Nye Tian's martial body endured was unimaginably terrifying. If he hadn't forcefully stabilized his martial body with the heavenly Tao shackles, his martial body would have collapsed long ago. But at this moment, the power of the heavenly Tao shackles was slowly weakening. Nye Tian's martial body was trembling non-stop, as if it could collapse at any time. This is bad. At this time, the Ghost Emperor's voice rang out, sounding extremely panicked. He had never imagined that the battle before him would reach this point. The fact that Nye Tian could last until now had far exceeded his expectations. But at this moment, the power of the sword Heavenly Tribulation had seeped into Nye Tian's body. This was extremely troublesome. If he didn't immediately force out the power of the Heavenly Tribulation, Nye Tian's martial body would be torn apart bit by bit. The reason why there was a qualitative difference between a sage monarch and sage monarch Tianyi was the power of the heavenly tribulation. Heavenly tribulation was a tribulation from the heavens. Every martial artist who wanted to advance to the heavenly tribulation realm had to undergo the test of the heavenly tribulation. Many sage monarch Tianyi martial artists didn't dare to rashly attack the heavenly tribulation realm because they were afraid of being killed by the power of the heavenly tribulation. Under normal circumstances, only 1/10 of the martial artists who attacked the heavenly tribulation realm would be able to successfully break through. The remaining 9/10 would be killed by the power of the heavenly tribulation. The sword heavenly tribulation was actually the same. It wasn't much different from the martial Tao's heavenly tribulation. Nie Tian only had the cultivation of the 8th level heavenly charm. Even if his martial body was strong, it was far from being able to withstand the power of the heavenly tribulation. The berserk power of the heavenly tribulation in his body would take his life. At this moment, Nie Tian looked at Ing Changfeng, who was high up in the sky. His eyes were incomparably gloomy, flickering with a cold and murderous glint. Ing Changfeng's shamelessness had exceeded his expectations. He had actually attacked him in front of so many people. At this moment, he also had killing intent in his heart. He could borrow the power of the sword formation in the sky to kill Ing Changfeng. Nie Tian, how much longer can you hold on? Ing Changfeng stabilized his body and stared at Nie Tian with a piercing cold intent in his eyes. He was practically roaring. He was obviously feeling guilty at this moment. He didn't expect Nie Tian to be able to hold on until this point. It's enough to kill you, Nie Tian Tianling said coldly. He then took a step forward and the surrounding void suddenly sank. Then, a terrifying blood chi surged outside his body. Suddenly, the sword formation in the sky released a soaring sword aura as if it was going to destroy everything. At this moment, Nie Tian could no longer care about anything else. He actually burned his own blood chi to kill Ing Changfeng. You! Ing Changfeng's expression changed when he felt the terrifying sword pressure. He said in a trembling voice, "Are you going to kill me?" "Why can't I?" Nie Tian shouted in a low voice. The sword formation in the sky's aura was still soaring. Since he had already made up his mind to kill, he couldn't afford to make any mistakes. He must kill Ing Changfeng with the next sword attack. Do you dare to kill this sect master in front of so many Qiankuan sect swordsmen? Ing Changfeng's eyes were trembling, and his eyes were clearly filled with fear as he shouted wildly. At this moment, he finally remembered that he was the sect master of the Qiankuan sect. However, at this moment, the surrounding crowd was watching from afar and retreating. Ing Changfeng frowned. He was so shocked that he couldn't say a word. Am I really going to die in the hands of Nie Tian? Die. At this moment, Nie Tian let out a low roar. The sword formation in the sky suddenly moved and a roar exploded in the void. It was about to collapse. Ing Changfeng's eyes suddenly narrowed. At this moment, he could really feel the aura of death. However, at this moment, Nie Tian's body trembled violently. Then, he spat out a mouthful of blood. The heavenly shackles that wrapped around his body had directly collapsed. Oh no! In an instant, Nie Tian's eyes trembled and he screamed in his heart. Then, the sword formation in the sky around his body collapsed. He felt a terrifying force in his body. It was like a flood or a ferocious beast that was attacking his martial body. It seemed like it was going to tear his entire body apart. Oh no! The power of the heavenly tribulation is acting up. At the same time, the Ghost Emperor's voice was heard. He screamed and his throat went numb. Chapter 36. An uninvited guest. Bang, bang, bang. Nie Tian stood high up in the sky and his body kept trembling. He heard cracking sounds coming from his body. It was the sound of his meridians and bones being destroyed by the power of heaven's retribution. His body swayed like a small boat floating in the boundless sea and his consciousness began to blur. What's wrong with Nye Tian? Everyone looked at the scene high up in the sky and could not help but tremble. They exclaimed in unison, not knowing what was happening to Nye Tian. This is my chance. At that moment, Ing Chongfeng's eyes were burning and he shouted in surprise. His face became ferocious because of his fanaticism. The sudden change made him overjoyed because it had brought him the best opportunity. Go to hell. The next moment, Ing Chongfeng roared and a cold light flashed in his eyes. He took a step forward and rushed toward Nye Tian like a bolt of lightning. The crowd's eyes trembled. They did not expect that Ing Chongfeng would still attack Nye Tian under such circumstances. Nye Tian's eyes trembled and his consciousness began to blur. He could only vaguely see Ing Chongfeng's figure approaching him. Boom! At that moment, Ing Chongfeng slashed out with his sword. A violent sword shadow appeared and pressed directly toward Nye Tian. If the sword fell, Nye Tian would definitely die on the spot. At the moment of life and death, a sudden change occurred. Ing Chongfeng. A deep voice sounded in the void. Then, the void seemed to be torn apart and a space-time vortex appeared. A black-clothed figure walked out of it. Boom! The crowd's eyes trembled violently as they looked up at the black-clothed figure. They saw that the person had slammed his palm down and the surrounding void suddenly sank. A giant flaming palm appeared in the void and suddenly fell. Where the flaming palm's shadow fell, a strange scene happened. The sword shadow in the void was instantly torn apart and collapsed in the blink of an eye as if it had evaporated. At this moment, the black-robed figure landed directly. The surrounding void suddenly sank, as if it was shrouded by a terrifying pressure. Then, the man stretched out his hand, and a fiery sword intent gushed out, enveloping Nye Tian. However, Nye Tian had already fallen into a coma. Who are you? Ing Chongfeng was taken aback by the sudden scene. After he stabilized his body, he let out a low roar and screamed. Ing Chongfeng, how dare you try to kill the Lord of the Sky in front of so many people? The man suddenly turned around and locked his blade-like eyes on Ing Chongfeng. Do you know that what you're doing is treason? He said coldly. You! Ing Chongfeng's eyes couldn't help but tremble when he saw this person. He let out a cry of horror and his entire body began to tremble as if he had seen a very frightening scene. His voice trembled as he said, You are Mo Yunfan. Ing Chongfeng, at least you still remember me. Mo Yunfan smiled faintly. His eyes were cold as he said playfully, You didn't expect this, did you? I, Mo Yunfan, am back again. You? Aren't you dead? Ing Chongfeng screamed in horror. His voice had become extremely sharp. Of course, he was no stranger to the name Mo Yunfan, as this was the person who had grown up with him. He was his senior brother. The heavens have eyes and allowed me, Mo Yunfan, to live until now. The corners of Mo Yunfan's mouth twitched as he said coldly, Ing Chongfeng, you must be very desperate to see that I'm still alive. You. Ing Chongfeng's eyes trembled and he was speechless. At that moment, everyone looked at Mo Yunfan in surprise and confusion. Only some of the older swordsmen present knew Mo Yunfan's name. A long time ago, Mo Yunfan and Ing Chongfeng were senior brothers. At that time, the two of them were the most outstanding swordsmen in the Qiankuan sect. They were the Qiankuan swordsmen of their generation, just like Zhu Zia and Ing Longshao. As the senior brother, Mo Yunfan's strength had always been slightly stronger than Ing Chongfeng's. However, one day, the two of them actually had a Qiankuan showdown for some unknown reason. The outcome of that battle was beyond everyone's expectations. Mo Yunfan was defeated miserably. Not only did Ing Chongfeng devour his sword intent, but he was also expelled from the Qiankuan sect and went missing. According to rumors, Ing Chongfeng was afraid that Mo Yunfan would take revenge, so he secretly killed Mo Yunfan. Who would have thought that many years later, when Ing Chongfeng was already the Qiankuan sect master, Mo Yunfan would actually appear again? Furthermore, The Mo Yunfan who appeared again was actually stronger than Ing Chongfeng. Ing Chongfeng, you didn't kill me back then. I, Mo Yunfan, swear that when I return to the Qiankuan sect again, you will pay 100 times, 1,000 times the price. Mo Yunfan's eyes were incomparably gloomy as he stared cold at Ing Chongfeng and practically enunciated every word. During the Qiankuan showdown between him and Ing Chongfeng back then, he fell into Ing Chongfeng's trap, which led to a crushing defeat. After he was expelled from the Qiankuan sect, Ing Chongfeng actually did not let him go and actually sent someone to assassinate him. The heavens had eyes, allowing him to live, and to live until now. Today, he returned to the Qiankuan sect, and it was the moment when Ing Chongfeng paid the price. Mo Yunfan, what right do you have to make me pay the price? I'm the Qiankuan sect master now, and you are just a traitor of the Qiankuan sect. Ing Chongfeng calmed down a lot at this time and said with a cold smile, Is that so? Mo Yunfan's mouth twitched a little. He then extended his hand and revealed a sword-shaped token. He smiled coldly and said, Ing Chongfeng, as the Qiankuan sect master, you should recognize this token, right? This is... Ing Chongfeng's eyes trembled when he saw the token in Mo Yunfan's hand. He exclaimed, This is the Sword of the Sky token. Not bad. You're not too stupid. Mo Yunfan smiled faintly with a cold murderous intent surging in his eyes. You're from the Sword of the Sky token? Ing Chongfeng's expression suddenly changed. His eyes trembled as he was extremely shocked. Sword of the Sky token. Everyone's eyes trembled violently when they heard this name and exclaimed in unison. The people from the Heart of the Sky token were no strangers to the Sword of the Sky token. The Sword of the Sky token was also the force behind the Heart of the Sky token, but it was not one of the 5 forces. It was considered the 6th force outside of the 5 forces. The Sword of the Sky token transcended the 5 forces and played the role of maintaining the balance of the 5 forces. Each of the 5 forces had their own strengths and weaknesses. If it was not for the existence of the Sword of the Sky token, the weaker forces would have long been swallowed by the stronger forces. It was rumored that the Sword of the Sky token existed for the sake of the Lord of the Sky token. However, after the 5 forces had coexisted peacefully for such a long time, the Sword of the Sky token had not appeared for a long time. The swordsmen from the 5 forces had almost forgotten about the existence of the Sword of the Sky token. This is impossible. Ing Chongfeng looked at Mo Yunfan. Suddenly, his eyes trembled and he exclaimed, You can't be from the Sword of the Sky token. Back then, I had already swallowed your sword intent and destroyed your sword cultivation. Even if you could survive, you wouldn't be able to hold a sword again. The Sword of the Sky token wouldn't want someone who couldn't hold a sword. Chapter 36-37. Plotting Treason Boom. As soon as Mo Yunfan took a step forward, a mighty sword momentum soared into the sky, causing the surrounding void to tremble slightly. The space within tens of thousands of meters was filled with extremely terrifying sword intent, forming a huge sword intent vortex with Mo Yunfan as the center. The surrounding time and space began to tumble under the pressure of the sword intent vortex. The momentum of heaven and earth changed, as if heaven and earth were bowing to Mo Yunfan. How is this possible? Ing Chongfeng's eyes trembled as he felt the sword pressure coming toward him, and he cried out in shock. Of course, he recognized the sword intent vortex. It was the sword perception vortex, a power that could only be released by a swordsman who had achieved the anti-god sword perception state. This undoubtedly meant that Mo Yunfan was already a swordsman who had achieved the anti-god sword perception state. However, this was simply impossible. Mo Yunfan's sword intent had been devoured by him back then, and his sword principle had been completely destroyed. How could he become an anti-god sword practitioner, and his sword principle strength was even stronger than his, the Qiankuan Gate Master? Ing Chongfeng's eyes could not stop trembling, and one could imagine the shock in his heart. He couldn't understand what had happened to Mo Yunfan. Ing Chongfeng, are you surprised? Mo Yunfan looked at Ing Chongfeng, who was in a state of shock, and said with a cold smile, "Thank you for your viciousness back then. Otherwise I, Mo Yunfan, would not be here today." As his cold voice fell, Mo Yunfan's eyes suddenly darkened, and his killing intent was revealed. What are you going to do?" Ing Chongfeng's pupils shrank when he sensed the cold, killing intent. His voice began to tremble, and it was obvious that he was panicking. He and Mo Yunfan had a deep hatred toward each other, and Mo Yunfan's return this time was obviously for revenge. Moreover, Mo Yunfan was now an anti-god sword practitioner, and his strength was far superior to his. Not to mention that he was currently seriously injured. Even if he was in peak condition, he would not be able to fight against an anti-god sword practitioner. The most terrifying thing was that Mo Yunfan was a member of the Sword Soul in the Sky, and his status was even higher than his, the Qianquan Gate Master. At this moment, so many people had witnessed Ing Chongfeng trying to kill the Lord of the Sky. Mo Yunfan could totally kill Ing Chongfeng as the Sword Soul Enforcer in the Sky. In any case, Nie Tian had the title of the Master of the Sky. Even if the people of the 5 major forces did not acknowledge his identity, he was still the supreme supremacy of the 5 major forces in name. Anyone from the 5 forces who dared to lay a hand on Nie Tian would have to bear the name of treason. Mo Yunfan's appearance meant that the Sword Soul in the Sky had intervened. In a way, this was a great reinforcement for Nie Tian's position as the Lord of the Sky. At this moment, everyone's eyes were focused on Mo Yunfan, as if they were anticipating something. What do I want to do? Mo Yunfan's eyes were deep and murderous as he locked his gaze on Ing Chongfeng. His lips curled into a cold smile as he said, "Ing Chongfeng, what you did to me back then is enough for me to kill you 1,000 times. I'm the Qianquan Gate Master. You dare to kill me?" Ing Chongfeng's eyes trembled. Although his words were tough, his voice was trembling. "That's right." Mo Yunfan's lips curled into a smile as he said, "You're now the Qianquan Gate Master and one of the 5 venerables in the sky. However, you seem to have forgotten that I'm now the Sword Soul Enforcer in the sky. I can enforce the law impartially and not care about past grievances. However, what you just did is a crime of treason. As the Sword Soul Enforcer, I can kill you right now." Ing Chongfeng immediately felt a roar in his head as soon as the word kill was uttered. His body could not help but sway as he took a few steps back and almost fell. Mo Yunfan was right. Based on what he just did, it was enough for Mo Yunfan to kill him. "Mo Yunfan, I'm the Qianquan Gate Master. If you want to kill me, you'll have to get the approval of the masters of the other 4 forces." At that moment, Ing Chongfeng's eyes trembled as he suddenly thought of something. "Is that so?" Mo Yunfan smiled cold and said, "Ing Chongfeng, your identity is indeed special. You're one of the 5 venerables in the sky, so you can't be killed so easily. However, you seem to have forgotten that the Sword Soul Enforcers in the sky have the right to kill first and report later under special circumstances." "Kill first and report later?" Ing Chongfeng's eyes trembled when he heard those words. His body was drenched in cold sweat, and his spine and tailbone were ice cold. It was very obvious what kill first and report later meant. Mo Yunfan would directly kill Ing Chongfeng before the venerables in the sky knew about it. Given the hatred between Mo Yunfan and Ing Chongfeng, it was not strange for Mo Yunfan to kill first and report later. "Mo Yunfan, we're in the Qianquan Gate now. Do you really dare to kill me, the Qianquan Gate Master, in front of millions of Qianquan Gate disciples?" Ing Chongfeng calmed down and looked coldly at Mo Yunfan. He believed that even if Mo Yunfan wanted to kill him, he would not dare to do so immediately. After all, they were in front of the Qianquan Palace. "Qianquan Gate Master?" Mo Yunfan sneered and glanced at the surrounding Qianquan Gate disciples. Then, he locked his gaze on Ing Chongfeng and sneered. Ing Changfeng, do you remember that you're the Qianquan Gate Master now? When you killed the Master of the Sky just now, did it ever cross your mind that you're the Qianquan Gate Master? Do you know that the entire Qianquan Gate will bear the name of murdering their master together with you after killing the Master of the Sky Gate? I'm afraid you were only thinking about yourself at that time. You never thought about the entire Qianquan Gate. You ignored the entire Qianquan Gate for your own selfish desires. Don't you think that you're a little ridiculous as the Qianquan Gate Master? The cold voice was interrogative and sonorous, and it was like a thunderclap that exploded in the ears of the Qianquan Gate disciples. At this moment, the way everyone looked at Ing Changfeng could not help but change. While they were angry, there was also a hint of disdain. The swordsmen present were not fools. Before Mo Yunfan said those words, everyone felt that Ing Changfeng's action of killing Ye Tian on the spot was very inappropriate. If Ing Changfeng was dissatisfied with Ye Tian, he could have directly stated that he did not recognize Ye Tian as the Master of the Sky Gate. He could have even directly kicked Ye Tian out of the Qianquan Gate. However, it was completely inappropriate for him to kill Ye Tian on the spot. No matter what, Ye Tian's status was higher than Ing Changfeng's in name, so killing him was considered a rebellion. Mo Yunfan, what do you want? Ing Changfeng's eyes trembled. At this moment, he truly realized the seriousness of the matter. His teeth were chattering as he spoke, and he could not even speak smoothly. Judging from Mo Yunfan's appearance, he would not let him off today. Chapter 36-38. Three Things. Ing Changfeng's eyes trembled slightly when he heard Mo Yunfan's words. He was like a desperate person who had suddenly grabbed onto a life-saving straw. The current situation was already a life-and-death situation for him. Mo Yunfan wanted to kill him, and the people of Qianquan sect no longer trusted him as the sect master. In addition, he had framed Mo Yunfan and wanted to kill the Master of the Sky. He had committed all sorts of evil deeds that could not be punished. Mo Yunfan had asked for 3 favors and spared his life, which was already a huge favor. One must know that with Mo Yunfan's strength, killing a severely injured Ing Changfeng was as easy as flipping his hand. Perhaps Mo Yunfan still remembered the brotherly relationship between the two of them. After all, the two of them grew up together and cultivated together. Although they were not related by blood, they were like brothers. Ing Changfeng understood Mo Yunfan's character very well. The latter valued relationships and kept his promises. It was precisely because of this that Mo Yunfan was so easily schemed against by him back then. At the moment, Mo Yunfan's soft-heartedness made Ing Changfeng feel that the latter was remembering the past. "Senior brother, please speak." Ing Changfeng's eyes flickered and revealed a blazing gaze. He even changed the way he addressed Mo Yunfan. Mo Yunfan's lips twitched as he said coldly, "The first thing is to abolish your own sword principle and step down as the sect master of Qianquan." Abolish my own sword principle? Ing Changfeng's pupils constricted when he heard those words. His expression changed as he exclaimed. He was a swordsman with a cultivation base of the 9th heaven sword tribulation. This was the achievement of his hundreds of thousands of years of cultivation, and it was the most glorious thing in his life. However, Mo Yunfan actually asked him to abolish his own sword principle. This was simply more painful than killing him directly. He could ignore his identity as the sect master of Qianquan, but abolishing his own sword principle was too cruel for him. "Senior brother, I can let you be the sect master of Qianquan, but can you abolish my own sword principle?" Ing Changfeng suddenly raised his head and looked at Mo Yunfan. His eyes were filled with desire. Ing Changfeng. However, before Ing Changfeng could finish speaking, Mo Yunfan let out a deep roar and shouted Ing Changfeng's name word by word. His voice was as forceful as thunder and as cold as ice as he said, "Do you think that with my current strength and status, I would still care about the position of Qianquan Gate Master? This Ing Chongfeng's expression changed in shock. He was stunned and speechless. Mo Yunfan was already a swordsman of the defiant sword spirit, and he had also joined the Sky Sword Soul. Indeed, the position of Qianquan Gate Master was no longer important to him. Ing Chongfeng, if you want to live, destroy your own sword principle right now. Mo Yunfan's eyes were deep and murderous as he stared at Ing Chongfeng like a sharp blade and said, I want you to experience the pain of having my sword Dao cultivation stripped away. Ing Chongfeng's eyes widened as he uttered a cry of astonishment. The fear in his heart was written all over his face. Back then, he had devoured Mo Yunfan's sword intent in the name of the Qianquan Showdown. And now, Mo Yunfan wanted to get back at them. Moreover, he wanted to get back at them in front of all the disciples of the Qianquan Gate. Live or die, it's your choice, Mo Yunfan said coldly. I'll count to 3. I want to hear your answer. This. Ing Chongfeng was horrified, and beads of sweat oozed out of his forehead like rain. 1, 2. At that moment, Mo Yunfan's voice was heard one after another. His voice was like a clap of thunder and a sharp blade that bombarded Ing Chongfeng's ears and pierced his heart. 3. Mo Yunfan counted for the 3rd time and took a step forward. His entire body's sword momentum erupted like a raging wave, causing the surrounding void to tremble as if it was about to collapse. I want to live. Almost at the same time, Ing Chongfeng roared. He was obviously panicking. Very well. The corner of Mo Yunfan's mouth twitched. The smile on his face was extremely strange as he sneered. My good junior brother, you really didn't let me down. Ing Chongfeng's eyes trembled slightly as he was horrified. He suddenly had a feeling that he had fallen into Mo Yunfan's trap. If he destroyed his sword principle, he would be no different from an ordinary Lord Tianyi martial artist. However, he still had strength after all, so he chose to continue living. Just like Mo Yunfan in the past, there was only hope if he lived. Perhaps he could cultivate the sword principle again like Mo Yunfan and return to the Qianquan Gate. Let's do it, Mo Yunfan said coldly with a sinister smile. Ing Chongfeng's eyes trembled and his face became extremely ugly. He was stunned on the spot for a long time. Let's do it. Mo Yunfan roared like thunder in the 9 heavens. Ing Chongfeng's mind rumbled as if he had just woken up from a dream. There was a trace of despair in his eyes. He glanced at Mo Yunfan and saw that the latter had a cold expression. All right. In the next instant, Ing Chongfeng let out a deep roar and made up his mind. The sword intent in his body surged and his body trembled. The sword intent in his body gushed out and was filled with a bloody aura. Everyone's eyes trembled and their expressions changed. In the blink of an eye, the sword intent in Ing Chongfeng's body dissipated completely. His hundreds of thousands of years of sword principle cultivation was directly crippled. Mo Yunfan's eyes narrowed and a sinister smile appeared on his face. The second matter, Ing Chongfeng, who was much calmer at the moment, shouted at Mo Yunfan with a cold expression. Ing Chongfeng, you and I are from the same sect, but you framed me with a scheme. You can't escape the name of killing a fellow disciple. Mo Yunfan smiled cold and said, in the name of a senior brother, I will enforce the rules of the sect on behalf of my teacher. I will punish you to go to the cliff of repentance to reflect on your mistakes and never step out of the cliff of repentance for the rest of your life. Mo Yunfan, you. Ing Chongfeng's expression changed as he cried out in shock. His face was completely frozen. He had never expected that Mo Yunfan would first destroy his sword principle and then make him go to the cliff of repentance to reflect on his mistake. Mo Yunfan was clearly trying to imprison him. At that moment, he suddenly understood what the sinister smile on Mo Yunfan's face meant. Mo Yunfan did not care about their past relationship at all. His methods were very sinister, and he wanted Ing Chongfeng to live a life worse than death. What? Don't you want to repent? Mo Yunfan smiled cold, and the corner of his lips curled into a smug expression. Ing Changfeng was stunned for a long time before he finally reacted. His eyes became lifeless as he lifted his head and said, "The third matter." At that moment, his sword principle was destroyed. What else could he do other than listening to Mo Yunfan's manipulation? The third matter is very simple. Mo Yunfan smiled faintly and said, "Since you're no longer the Heaven and Earth Gate Master, you've also lost your identity as a supremacy of the sky. Now hand over the 5 will of the sky in your hand." When Ing Changfeng heard the words 5 will of the sky, his expression changed drastically, and he exclaimed, "You want the 5 will of the sky?" The heart of the sky was the leader of the 5 forces and became the 5 supremacies of the sky. In the hands of the 5 supremacies, each of them grasped a power that represented the will of the heart of the sky, and they were known as the 5 will of the sky. Chapter 36-39. Chapter 36-34. Chapter 36-34 Qiankuan Sword Intent. Why? Are you not willing to hand it over? Mo Yunfan looked at Ing Changfeng and his face darkened. A cold murderous intent surged in his eyes. The Qiankuan sect swordsmen's expressions changed when they saw this. They looked at Mo Yunfan with a strange expression. The 5 spirits in the sky represented the 5 supremacies in the sky. It was also the proof of the heart of the sky's 5 forces. As the enforcer of the sword soul in the sky, Missouri Yunfan could indeed remove Ing Changfeng's position as the Qiankuan sect master after he committed a grave mistake. However, Mo Yunfan was not qualified to take the 5 spirits in the sky. Strictly speaking, only martial supremacies in the sky could take the 5 spirits in the sky. Ing Changfeng's position as the Qiankuan sect master had been removed and he was no longer the 5 supremacies in the sky. He should indeed hand over the 5 spirits in the sky. However, the 5 spirits in the sky should not be handed over to Mo Yunfan. It should be handed over to the next sect master of the Qiankuan sect. The Qiankuan sect had yet to select the next sect master. Hence, the 5 spirits in the sky should be handed over to the Elders Guild of the Qiankuan sect and not Mo Yunfan. After all, Mo Yunfan was not even a member of the Qiankuan sect. Mo Yunfan's direct request for the 5 spirits in the sky made people feel that he was up to no good. Mo Yunfan, even if I'm no longer the Qiankuan sect master, the 5 spirits in the sky shouldn't be handed over to you, right? Ing Changfeng's eyes darkened as he spoke coldly. At this time, he showed a bit of backbone. Ing Changfeng, if you don't hand over the Qiankuan sword intent to me, you and the entire Qiankuan sect will be annihilated, Mo Yunfan said coldly. What do you mean? Ing Changfeng's expression changed and his eyes trembled again. Could it be that Mo Yunfan was going to wipe out the Qiankuan sect for the 5 spirits in the sky? Do you think the master of the sky can still live? Mo Yunfan's expression changed slightly as he turned and locked his gaze on Nie Tian. Ing Changfeng's eyes narrowed as he looked at Nie Tian. Nie Tian was wrapped in a ball of sword will of fire. He couldn't see him, but he could sense his aura. It was very weak and intermittent, as if it would disappear in the next moment. Ing Changfeng's expression changed and was horrified. He immediately thought of something and said, "You want to use the universe sword intent to save Nie Tian?" When Nie Tian fought Ing Changfeng just now, his body had been penetrated by the power of the heavenly tribulation. Coupled with the pressure from the sword array in the sky, he was already on the verge of death. If Mo Yunfan had not forcefully used his sword intent to help him stabilize his martial body, he would have already exploded and died. However, Mo Yunfan's sword intent was limited after all, and he could only protect Nie Tian for a while. Next, he had to force Nie Tian to expel the power of the heavenly tribulation from his body. Otherwise, he would definitely die. Mo Yunfan wanted the universe sword intent, one of the 5 essences in the sky, in order to save Nie Tian. At this moment, The universe sword intent was the only way Mo Yunfan could think of to save Nye Tian. Other than that, do you think there's any other way to save him? Mo Yunfan's eyes were low and cold. If Ing Changfeng hadn't insisted on snatching the heart of the sky, things wouldn't have turned out like this. But he's only in the 8th stage of Heaven Yun. How can he withstand the universe sword intent? Ing Changfeng's eyes trembled and his expression was very ugly. It's up to him whether he can bear it or not, Mo Yunfan said with a gloomy expression. All I can do is give him a chance. If he dies, you should know what the consequences will be, right? Ing Changfeng's expression changed, and he was speechless for a moment. If Nye Tian died, it would indeed be a disaster for the entire Qiankuan sect. Mo Yunfan's risky move was actually to save Nye Tian. The 5 essences in the sky originally belonged to the heart of the sky and existed to protect the will of the sky. However, even if the Lord of the Sky needed the 5 essences in the sky, it would require the consent of 3 of the 5 supremes in the sky under normal circumstances. However, at this moment, Nye Tian's life was at stake and he urgently needed the 5 essences in the sky to save him. Mo Yunfan could only act according to special circumstances and directly use the universe sword intent to create a chance for Nye Tian to survive without anyone's consent. If you still think that you're from the Qiankuan sect, then hand over the universe sword intent. Mo Yunfan stopped talking nonsense with Ing Changfeng and said cold. Ing Changfeng's eyes trembled, and he only made up his mind after a long time. He flipped his palm and a white ball of light the size of a fist appeared in his palm. It was one of the 5 essences in the sky, the universe sword intent. Boom! The moment the sword will of heaven and earth appeared, a formless sword will wave appeared. A huge ripple of sword will appeared in the void. Everyone felt their hearts tremble at this moment. Their expressions changed, and they were extremely shocked. It was hard to imagine that the universe sword intent, which was only the size of a fist, could release such a massive sword intent. Everyone's eyes trembled and they looked shocked. Although they had long heard of the universe sword intent, it was their first time seeing it in person. The shock in their hearts was written all over their faces. Take it. Ing Changfeng looked at the universe sword intent in his hand and narrowed his eyes before throwing it to Mo Yunfan. Mo Yunfan put away the universe sword intent and looked at Ing Changfeng with trembling eyes. Go to the cliff of repentance yourself. Ing Changfeng nodded and did not say anything. Then, Mo Yunfan glanced at everyone and said cold, I'm going to treat the Lord of the Sky in the Universe Palace. No one is allowed to step into the Universe Palace without my orders. Yes. Everyone responded in unison. Then, an old man in white walked out. It was the great elder of the Qiankuan sect's Elder Union. His face was full of wrinkles and his eyes were filled with worry. Mo Yunfan, you must save the Lord of the Sky. I'll try my best. Mo Yunfan nodded slightly and did not say anything else. His figure moved and directly brought Nye Tian into the Universe Palace. The swordsmen of the Qiankuan sect watched as Mo Yunfan and Nye Tian's figures disappeared into the Universe Palace. Their eyes trembled and no one left. They understood that if Nye Tian died today, the Qiankuan sect would face a disaster. Ing Changfeng's face was cold and his eyes were filled with despair. Nye Tian's strength was far beyond his expectations. Mo Yunfan's sudden arrival caught him off guard. Today, everything he had worked hard for in the first half of his life had been wasted. He would spend the rest of his life in the cliff of repentance. The dignified Qiankuan sect master had fallen to such a state in a few days. It was really regrettable. At the same time, in the Universe Palace, above the palace, Nye Tian was wrapped in the flame sword intent and suspended in the air like a burning flame. His breath of life was rapidly fading. The universe sword intent appeared in Mo Yunfan's hand. He looked at Nye Tian with a gloomy face and said, Lord of the Sky, whether you can survive this or not depends on yourself. Chapter 3640. Change of Heavens and Earth. Bang. Above the heavenly palace, Nye Tion's body was enveloped by the heavenly sword intent, emitting a tremendous aura of the sword intent. The vigorous heavenly chi filled the entire heavenly palace. Mo Yunfan's eyes trembled as he stared at Nye Tian, trying to sense the latter's life force. Meanwhile, a violent collision was taking place inside Nye Tian's body. The heavenly sword intent sensed the aura of the heart of the sky and surged into Nye Tian's body like a ferocious beast, impacting his meridians and bones. At the same time, the force of the heavenly tribulation in his body became extremely violent, resisting the invasion of the heavenly sword intent. Bang bang bang! The bones and meridians inside Nye Tian's body that were initially damaged could no longer withstand the impact of the two powerful forces, and began to crumble. Nye Tian was like a broken leaf in an endless gale, being torn apart bit by bit. In the blink of an eye, his life force began to decline rapidly. The last bit of life force dropped to the freezing point, and was about to disappear. Oh no! Mo Yunfan's expression changed when he sensed this. His nerves tightened, and his heart began to tremble inexplicably. If Nye Tian was in his normal state, there was a high chance that he could merge with the heavenly sword intent. However, it was highly possible that his martial physique was already severely damaged, and could no longer withstand the impact of the heavenly sword intent. Meanwhile, the life force on Nye Tian's body had become extremely weak. Even Mo Yunfan, who was standing beside him, could only sense a faint aura. Nye Tian was like a man hanging on a cliff, with his last bit of life force acting as the only rope holding him up. Once the wisp of life force disappeared, his life would come to an end. However, strangely enough, the last bit of life force was extremely tenacious. Although it was weak, it did not disappear. Such a strong will! Mo Yunfan's eyes widened slightly as he was shocked. The reason why Nye Tian had been able to persist for so long was because of his strong willpower. If it was an ordinary martial artist, they would have given up long ago. The fact that Nye Tian could hold on until now was beyond Mo Yunfan's expectations. However, Nye Tian's martial body was in a terrible state. His entire body's flesh and blood were festering, his meridians and bones were shattered, and his entire body was practically a skeleton. He was only supported by the universe sword intent outside his body, otherwise, he would have collapsed long ago. After a while, the sword intent of the universe seemed to have gained the upper hand and began to slowly force out the power of the heavenly tribulation. At this moment, Nye Tian's life force began to slowly recover. Lord of the Sky, you have to hold on. Mo Yunfan's eyes were burning with excitement, and his heart was about to jump out of his chest. The power of the heavenly tribulation was forced out and the cosmic sword intent began to fuse with Nye Tian's martial body. This was the scene he wanted to see the most. Next, as long as Nye Tian stabilized his breathing, he would definitely be able to recover. Slowly, the cosmic sword intent poured into Nye Tian's martial body and turned into the most powerful life force, nourishing his meridians and bones. After a long time, Nye Tian's broken meridians and bones actually began to slowly recover. Success! Mo Yunfan's face changed, and his eyes flashed with a fiery light. He was so excited that he was about to jump up. But the next moment, he seemed to sense something, and his face changed suddenly. His whole person was stunned on the spot, and his mouth was wide open, but he could not make a sound. What is that power? Mo Yunfan froze on the spot for a long time, and his face was almost numb, before he spoke in surprise. Just a moment ago, he felt an extremely terrifying power in Nye Tian's body, which made his divine soul tremble, and he felt a strong threat. However, when he tried to sense this power carefully, he couldn't sense it no matter how hard he tried. That power had mysteriously disappeared, as if it had never existed in the first place. This made Mo Yunfan very surprised, and he could not understand what was going on. But he was very sure that the feeling just now was not an illusion. In Nye Tion's body, there was indeed a terrifying power that had awakened. Then, Nye Tion continued to absorb the heaven and earth sword intent. Half a day later, all of the heavenly tribulation power was forced out of him, and his martial body gradually returned to normal with the help of the heaven and earth sword intent. Everything seemed to be developing in a good direction, but Mo Yunfan's face did not look good. He had been sensing Nye Tion's aura, and did not dare to relax. But the strange thing was that he didn't sense that terrifying power again. At this moment, he really began to suspect that he had been hallucinating at that moment. There was a faint worry in his heart, and he felt that the power just now was extremely unusual. Then, another half a day passed, and the cosmic sword intent was completely absorbed by Nye Tion. His martial body had almost recovered, and it looked intact. His flesh and blood were complete, and he no longer looked like a bloody skeleton. Phew! Seeing this, Mo Yunfan could not help but let out a long sigh of relief, and his tensed face relaxed a lot. But at that moment, his eyes suddenly trembled, and his expression changed again. Once again, he sensed that terrifying power. What's going on? Mo Yunfan was shocked, and he exclaimed in his heart. This time, the force didn't disappear. Instead, it grew stronger and stronger. Like a ferocious beast, it violently battered Nye Tion's martial body. At that moment, Nye Tion's meridians and bones that had just recovered were about to collapse from the impact again. Oh no! Mo Yunfan's eyes trembled, and his face turned pale, and his body was drenched in cold sweat. Just as he had expected, that power was indeed very unusual. Boom! Boom! At that moment, two terrifying powers appeared in Nye Tion's martial body, circulating throughout his body, and stabilizing his meridians and bones. Primordial sacred souls. Mo Yunfan's expression changed again, and he immediately exclaimed. At that critical moment, the two primordial sacred souls in Nye Tion's body activated on their own to protect his meridians and bones. Boom! However, the next moment, the strange power suddenly increased, and a terrifying aura was released. Like an invisible giant hand, it filled every corner of Nye Tion's martial body. Following that, an extremely shocking scene occurred. That power directly devoured the two primordial sacred souls in an instant. That's right, it devoured them. The Sky Evolution Sacred Soul and the Myriad Tribulation Sacred Soul only lasted for a moment, and they were directly devoured by that power. Mo Yunfan's eyes narrowed, and his face froze again, and he was speechless. Those were two primordial sacred souls, and they possessed infinite power, but they were devoured in an instant. It was too strange. What kind of power was so terrifying that it could devour two primordial sacred souls in an instant? Chapter 36-41. Soul of the Sky, Soul of the Sky. Mo Yunfan wore a blank expression as he blurted out the words. His eyes trembled as he stared at Nye Tion in astonishment, as if he had just witnessed something terrifying. He did not expect that Nye Tion would awaken the soul of the sky after absorbing the Qiankuan sword intent. The clear sky soul was the only power he could think of that could devour two immemorial sacred souls in an instant. Mo Yunfan was certain that the force inside Nye Tion's body was the soul of the sky. However, he could not understand why Nye Tion would awaken the soul of the sky. According to the records of the Heart of the Sky, the Master of the Sky could only awaken the soul of the sky after absorbing 3 intents of the sky. However, Nye Tion was able to awaken the soul of the sky after absorbing 1 intent of the sky. This was too terrifying. Besides, Nye Tion's strength was too weak. With a cultivation of the 8th layer heavenly rhythm, could he really withstand the pressure from the soul of the sky? Mo Yunfan's heart was in a mess. He felt like his head was about to explode. The scene before him had completely exceeded his expectations. He had no idea what was going to happen to Nye Tion next. Bang! At this moment, Nye Tion's body trembled slightly. Then, a vast and boundless aura of sword intent was released, forming an invisible wave of sword intent in the void, spreading out like ripples. Puff! The sudden change caused Mo Yunfan's eyes to flicker. He could feel his heart shuddering as he vomited a mouthful of blood. At that instant, he could feel the sword intent in his body going out of control. It was burning like a flame, as if it was going to devour his entire body. Damn it! Mo Yunfan's expression sank as his eyes were filled with astonishment. He let out a furious roar as he tried to suppress the sword intent that was going out of control. Puff! However, the more he tried to suppress it, the more violent the sword intent became. His body trembled and he spat out another mouthful of blood. At the same time, the swordsmen outside the Heaven and Earth Palace also felt the fluctuation of sword intent coming from the void. Their faces changed, and then their divine souls felt threatened. After a tremble, the sword intent in their bodies became violent, incomparably agitated, and crazily circulated in their martial bodies. PFFF, PFFF, PFFF. Following that, the sound of blood being spat out could be heard. The hundreds of thousands of swordsmen all spat out blood. Their faces turned pale in an instant, as if they had been severely injured. Just like Mo Yunfan, those swordsmen who tried to forcefully suppress the sword intent spat out another mouthful of blood, their faces turning even paler. What's going on? Everyone was frightened by this sudden change. Countless panicked faces looked at the people around them in fear. What was going on with that wave of sword intent? Why was it so powerful? Fortunately, that wave of sword intent soon disappeared, and everyone's sword intent quickly calmed down, no longer as violent as before. After the sword intent fluctuation disappeared, everything returned to normal, as if nothing had happened. However, everyone's faces were very pale, and their eyes were surging with fear. Hey! I've broken through. At this moment, suddenly someone shouted in surprise. I've broken through too. Following that, another person shouted in surprise. I've broken through too. I've broken through too. Following that, more surprised voices sounded. Everyone's panicked faces were instantly replaced by joy, and their eyes were blazing with excitement. After that wave of sword intent fluctuation disappeared, they actually found that their sword principal realm had magically broken through. At the same time, in the Heaven and Earth Palace, Mo Yunfan's expression was dull as he stared blankly at Nye Tian, who was floating in midair. His mouth was wide open, but he was completely speechless. He couldn't believe the scene in front of him. It was too terrifying. Outside Nye Tian's body, an extremely powerful sword intent surged, and a sharp aura was released, filling the entire Heaven and Earth Palace. Mo Yunfan was only about 10 meters away from Nye Tian, and he felt that his sword intent was completely suppressed by the sword intent in the space around him, and he couldn't fight back at all. This was what shocked him greatly. After all, he was a swordsman in Sword Sense Inverse Realm. Even a swordsman at the peak of Sword Sense Inverse Realm could not completely suppress him and make him unable to fight back. Only the swordsman of Saint Defire could suppress him to the point where he couldn't fight back. And Nye Tian was only at the 4th heavenly realm of Sword Aura. In Saint Realm Sword Principle, he could only be considered a swordsman. A swordsman at the 4th heavenly realm of Sword Aura released a sword intent that made him, a swordsman with Sword Sense Inverse Realm, unable to fight back. How could he not be surprised? Mo Yunfan experienced this personally, and the shock in his heart could not be any greater. If someone else had told him this, he would never have believed it. However, the sword intent that filled the air might be very oppressive, but it did not cause any harm to Mo Yunfan. Mo Yunfan thought that if the sword intent outside his body wanted to hurt him, it would definitely be able to kill him in an instant. The soul of the sky has awakened, and the sword intent released in an instant is actually so terrifying. It's comparable to that of a swordsman at the peak of Saint Defire. It's too terrifying. Mo Yunfan did not dare to fight back, fearing that the sword intent in the air would become violent. He looked at Nye Tian with trembling eyes, and he could not hide his fear. At that moment, he was certain that Nye Tian had indeed awakened the soul of the sky. Otherwise, with his level of cultivation, it would have been impossible for him to release such a terrifying sword intent. At that moment, an extremely terrifying change was happening in Nye Tian's body. The soul of the sky had awakened and devoured the two ancient sacred souls in his body. At the same time, it released a terrifying sword intent that surged in his body like a wild beast. As the sword intent surged, Nye Tian's flesh, blood, bones, and meridians all underwent shocking changes. Within his flesh, bones, and meridians, a terrifying sword intent seeped into them, instantly strengthening them greatly. Even their shapes changed subtly. His flesh, bones, and meridians were like sharp swords, exuding an incomparably sharp aura. Under the influence of the sword intent, his martial body became even stronger. After a long while, the sword intent in the air around him began to slowly weaken. It surged into Nye Tian's body and became one with it. This. Mo Yunfan looked at Nye Tian, and his eyes trembled slightly. He wanted to say something, but he could not. At that moment, Nye Tian's body trembled, and his tightly shut eyes opened. When Mo Yunfan saw that Nye Tian had woken up, his eyes lit up, and he shouted in surprise, "Lord of the Sky!" Chapter 36:42. Chapter 36:37. Chapter 36:37. Sword Soul Protection. In the Universal Palace, Nye Tian stood still. It was as if he was no longer a person, but a sword. His entire body exuded an extremely sharp aura. At this moment, he felt a sword intent aura circulating in his body. It merged with his body and became his own strength. Sword Spirit Constitution. At this moment, the Ghost Emperor's voice suddenly sounded. He was extremely shocked. Nye Tian's flesh, blood, bones, and meridians were all filled with sword intent. Wasn't this the Sword Spirit Constitution? It seemed that after Nye Tian absorbed the universal sword intent and awakened the soul of the sky, he had directly nurtured the Sword Spirit Constitution. Moreover, his Sword Spirit Constitution was far stronger than an ordinary Sword Spirit Constitution. The sword intent just now had suppressed Mo Yunfan to the point where he couldn't fight back. Nye Tian's eyes narrowed slightly. With a thought, he sensed the sword intent aura in his body and couldn't help but smile. He could sense that his sword intent was much stronger than before. Without a doubt, the awakening of the soul of the sky had once again made a qualitative leap in his strength. However, his sword Dao realm did not break through. It was still at the fourth heaven of sword aura. Because of this, one could see how powerful he was. The lower his cultivation level, the more it meant that he had great potential. At this moment, Nye Tian was confident that he could fight against a high-level oracle swordsman without activating the soul of the sky. If he activated the soul of the sky, he could probably kill any oracle swordsman in an instant. At this moment, Mo Yunfan's eyes trembled slightly, and he shouted again, "Lord of the Sky!" Only then did Nye Tian snap out of his daze. He landed on the ground and bowed deeply towards Mo Yunfan, expressing his sincere gratitude. "Thank you for saving my life, Senior." When Mo Yunfan appeared, his consciousness was already a little blurred, but he was still aware of the general situation. If Mo Yunfan hadn't appeared, even if Ing Changfeng didn't kill him, he would have died under the power of the heavenly tribulation. Mo Yunfan fully deserved the debt of saving his life. "Lord of the Sky, you're exaggerating. The sword soul of the sky exists to protect the Lord of the Sky. I'm just doing my duty." Mo Yunfan was stunned for a moment before he responded with a faint smile. "You don't have to be so polite, Senior. Just call me Nye Tian." Nye Tian smiled. He was not used to being called the Lord of the Sky. "How can I do that? We are master and servant. How can I call the Lord of the Sky by his name? Mo Yunfan was very respectful and respectful. Nie Tian smiled faintly and did not say anything. He didn't care about how he addressed him. Mo Yunfan could call him whatever he wanted. Mo Yunfan's attitude towards him was very sincere, unlike Ying Chongfeng's hypocrisy. At this moment, Nie Tian was most concerned about the heart of the sky. Next, Nie Tian asked Mo Yunfan about the heart of the sky, and the latter told Nie Tian everything he knew. Unfortunately, Mo Yunfan didn't know much about the heart of the sky. Nie Tian only roughly understood the 5 forces of the heart of the sky and some things about the sword soul of the sky. Lord of the Sky, if you want to know more about the heart of the sky, you must ask my teacher. Mo Yunfan knew what Nie Tian was most concerned about, so he said with a faint smile. Nie Tian's pupils constricted as he went blank. Your teacher? Yes. Mo Yunfan nodded and said, among the 5 forces, only one person knows about the heart of the sky. That person is my teacher, the leader of the Heaven Martial Association, Divine Heaven Ancestor. Divine Heaven Ancestor, the Scarlet Life Loyal Heart. Nie Tian's eyes trembled after hearing Mo Yunfan's words. He didn't expect Mo Yunfan to be the disciple of the 8th Sky Messenger, Scarlet Life. Lord of the Sky knows teacher? Mo Yunfan asked after seeing Nie Tian's reaction. Yes. Nie Tian nodded with a smile. When I was still in the realm, I encountered some trouble. It was Lord Scarlet Life Loyal Heart who helped me solve it. I didn't expect you to be his disciple. So that's how it is. Mo Yunfan slightly nodded with a trace of surprise on his face. He didn't expect Nie Tian to have seen the Scarlet Life Loyal Heart before. No wonder he always felt that there was a familiar aura within Nie Tian's sword intent. This subordinate was expelled from the Qiankuan Gate, and my sword Dao cultivation was completely crippled. Fortunately, I met teacher. He saw that my aptitude was not bad, so he personally helped me recondense my sword intent and recultivate my sword Dao. Mo Yunfan recalled many things and said with a respectful expression, without teacher, there would be no Mo Yunfan today. Teacher has given me a new lease on life. Nie Tian nodded slightly. It turned out that Mo Yunfan had such a past. Lord of the Sky, are you going to meet the people from the other 4 forces? At this time, Mo Yunfan looked at Nie Tian and slightly frowned. The corner of Nie Tian's mouth twitched slightly, but he didn't answer right away. What happened at the Qiankuan Gate made him understand that his identity as the Lord of the Sky would not be easily recognized. Even in the Heaven Martial Association, where the Scarlet Life Loyal Heart was, most people would not be friendly to him. Ying Chongfeng actually wanted to kill him for the heart of the sky, which made him feel a lingering fear until now. If he went to the other forces, it was hard to guarantee that the same thing would not happen. The Qiankuan Gate was the weakest among the 5 forces. Ying Chongfeng's matter had just been resolved, and Nie Tian really didn't want to see similar things happen again. If possible, he wanted to visit the other 4 forces after a period of time. At least, he had to wait until his strength was stronger. However, he had promised Zhong Mingyu that he would take the initiative to visit the 5 forces. If he delayed any more time, he was afraid that it would put Zhong Mingyu in a difficult position. Lord of the Sky, if you don't want to meet the people from the 4 forces now, I can inform the 4 forces in the name of the Sword Soul in the sky that you need some time. Mo Yunfan saw Nie Tian's hesitation and said in a deep voice, if I do that, won't the 4 forces resent me? Nie Tian frowned and asked in a deep voice, Lord of the Sky, don't worry. With the Sword Soul in the sky, even if the people from the 4 forces resent me, they will not openly resist. Mo Yunfan nodded and said, the existence of the Sword Soul in the sky was originally to protect the Lord of the Sky. Since it was not suitable for Nie Tian to meet the people from the 4 forces now, Mo Yunfan would naturally find a way to help him. This was the protection from the Sword Soul in the sky. Okay. Nie Tian nodded and looked much more relaxed. He really didn't want to see the incident with the Qianquan Gate repeat, and he also didn't want the venerables in the sky of the other forces to become another Ing Changfeng. For the time being, not meeting the people from the other forces was the best solution at the moment. By the way, Senior, does the sword soul in the sky need new blood? At this time, Nie Tian squinted his eyes slightly and asked with some excitement. The sword soul in the sky exists to protect the Lord of the Sky. It is very strict with the selection of new people. Not everyone can join the sword soul in the sky. Mo Yunfan could obviously understand what Nie Tian meant, but his reaction was very cold. Even the Lord of the Sky could not interfere with the selection of new people by the sword soul in the sky. Chapter 36:43. Chapter 36:38. Chapter 36:38. Rising in the sky, Nie Tian could sense Mo Yunfan's indifference, but he still spoke his mind. He wanted Duanmu Lu and the others to join the sword spirit in the sky. Master of the Sky, do you know how many sword spirits there are in the sky? Mo Yunfan looked at Nie Tian impatiently. Nie Tian's expression grew grim as he shook his head. I don't know. There are only 36 official members. Mo Yunfan's eyes darkened as he said. Nie Tian frowned. He was stunned. He did not expect that there were only 36 sword spirits in the sky outside of the 5 forces. The sword spirits in the sky were supposed to protect the Master of the Sky and maintain the balance among the 5 forces. However, there were only 36 members in such a force. One had to know that even the weakest of the 5 forces, the Qianquan sect, had millions of disciples. Nie Tian realized how difficult it was for the sword spirits in the sky to select new members. The sword spirit in the sky is a sword that protects the Master of the Sky. This sword has its own sharpness. Even the Master of the Sky should not interfere with the sword spirits in the sky. Mo Yunfan looked at Nie Tian and said seriously. Nie Tian frowned, and his expression was obviously not very good. Senior, you have not seen the person I want to recommend. It's not good to reject me directly. However, he did not give up and said with a smile. It was difficult for the sword spirits in the sky to join, but this made Nie Tian even more determined. He must get Duanmu Lu and the others to join the sword spirits in the sky. At least, he had to fight for an opportunity for Duanmu Lu and the others. He brought Duanmu Lu and the others to the sacred world, but he did not give them a chance to train. Moreover, he had his own things to do. He did not have time to guide them. It might not be a good thing for Duanmu Lu and the others to follow him. For Duanmu Lu and the others, the sword soul in the sky was a very good opportunity. It was worth a try. Therefore, even if he had to show his face, Nie Tian had to fight for a chance for them. Mo Yunfan frowned. He didn't expect Nie Tian to be so insistent. After a moment of silence, he said, Lord of the Sky, please bring those people here. But whether or not we can give them a chance is up to me. Moreover, I'm only giving them a chance. As for whether they can join the sword soul in the sky, it's up to them. His expression was ugly. If Nie Tian was not the Lord of the Sky, he would have been furious. Of course. Nie Tian smiled faintly. He then had Duanmu Lu and the others come out from the 9 extremities. Are they the ones? Mo Yunfan glanced at Duanmu Lu and the others cold. He seemed a little dissatisfied. Indeed, Duanmu Lu and the others were very young. It was not bad for them to have such strength at their age. They could be called geniuses. However, such talent was still too weak to join the sword soul in the sky. Mo Yunfan was the top genius of the Qianquan sect. Even so, he had tried many times before he finally joined the sword soul in the sky. They all grew up in the territory. They followed me to the sacred world. Nie Tian's eyes narrowed slightly, and he said in a deep voice, Senior, I'm not speaking as the leader of the Clear Heaven sect now, but as their teacher. Please give them a chance. Teacher. Upon hearing this form of address, Mo Yunfan's eyes narrowed. At this moment, Nie Tian reminded him of his Crimson Life loyal heart. He had been able to join the Sword Soul in the Sky because of the Scarlet Life Loyal Heart's recommendation. He remembered clearly that the expression on the Crimson Life Loyal Heart's face at that moment was exactly the same as Nie Tian's. After thinking for a long time, Mo Yunfan finally agreed to give Duanmu Lu and the others a chance. Since they are martial artists from the territory, they are already very strong. I can take them back to the Sword Soul in the Sky, but whether they can stay or not is up to them. Nie Tian's eyes lit up as he hastily expressed his gratitude. Many thanks, Senior. He believed that what Duanmu Lu and the others needed was a chance. Nie Tian told Duanmu Lu and the others about the Sword Soul in the Sky. In the end, he smiled and said, I really got this chance by showing my face. I hope you can succeed. Teacher, don't worry. We will not let you down. Duanmu Lu nodded solemnly. In fact, he didn't want to stay with Nie Tian all the time. He didn't want to be a burden. Han Tian, Yang Zixiao, and Pring Xiongfei also nodded confidently. I hope you can surprise me the next time I see you. Nie Tian glanced at the 4 disciples and smiled faintly. Yes. The 4 of them nodded and were slightly moved. Next, you will take the cruelest test of the Sword Soul in the Sky. I hope you can survive. Mo Yunfan glanced at Duanmu Lu and the others and said calmly, I will. Duanmu Lu and the others nodded again. Their eyes were filled with extreme determination. They knew that this opportunity was hard to come by, so they would persist to the end and not let Nie Tian down. Next, Nie Tian and Mo Yunfan walked out of the Universal Palace together. The people of the Qiankuan sect saw that the Master of the Sky was still alive. When the people of the Qiankuan sect saw Nie Tian, they finally relaxed. They weren't glad that Nie Tian was still alive. They were glad that the Qiankuan sect was safe. Everyone looked at Nie Tian in shock, and couldn't help but whisper to each other. He has completely recovered. This is unbelievable. His aura is even sharper than before. It looks like he is much stronger than before. This is too scary. He is only a heavenly charm holy disciple, but he has really absorbed the universal sword essence. The sword essence we felt just now, could it be related to the Master of the Sky? The people discussed and looked at Nie Tian with complicated expressions. Among the shock, there was unconcealable fear. I know that most of you don't admit that I am the Master of the Sky. Nie Tian glanced at the crowd and said in a deep voice, I don't blame you because I know that I am too weak. I am not the Master of the Sky that you all want to see. However, I will leave you with one sentence. The next time I appear in the Qiankuan sect, I will show you the real Master of the Sky. Everyone was stunned when they heard his faint voice. Indeed, Nie Tian wasn't very strong, but his words were filled with a fierce aura that made people feel inexplicably shocked. Senior, I will be leaving now. After saying that, Nie Tian turned around and said to Mo Yunfan, who was beside him, without looking at the crowd's reaction. Now? Mo Yunfan was stunned. He didn't expect that Nie Tian would leave immediately. Yes. Nie Tian nodded with a smile and said, Staying here is just a waste of time. I have to improve my strength as soon as possible. Mo Yunfan could see the determination in Nie Tian's eyes and could only nod in agreement. It was indeed inappropriate for Nie Tian to stay after what had happened in the Qiankuan sect. Nie Tian smiled faintly and reminded Duanmu Lu and the others again. He left some things for them, mainly the Fenghun sacred pill that Ling Shuang Wuchen had given him to Duanmu Lu for them to consume at the appropriate time. After that, Nie Tian bid farewell to Ing Tsangqiong and the others and left without staying any longer. In the void, Nie Tian's figure quickly disappeared like a ray of light. Master of the Sky, I believe that you will become the real Master of the Sky. Mo Yunfan looked at the place where Nie Tian had disappeared with a passionate look in his eyes. Chapter 36:44. Chapter 36:39. Chapter 36:39. You try. In the Cloud-Zurge sacred world, two figures stood in the air above the Cosmos mountain range. They were precisely Nie Tian and Lan Zhuing. After leaving the Qiankuan Gate, Nie Tian followed the Qiankuan mountain range all the way to the west. After a day, he finally crossed the Qiankuan mountain range and arrived at the other side of the mountain range. At this moment, Nie Tianling was hovering in the air. The corners of his mouth were slightly raised, and there was a somewhat strange smile on his face. Nie Tian, what's wrong? Lan Zhuing's eyes flickered when she saw Nie Tian's reaction. Come out. Nie Tian glanced at Lan Zhuing and smiled strangely. After that, he looked at the void and shouted. Lan Zhuing was stunned. She didn't know who Nie Tian was talking to. She didn't sense anything strange in the void. As the sound of Nie Tian's voice faded, the space in the distance trembled slightly as tens of black-robed silhouettes appeared. Each of them wore black robes that covered their faces. Their baleful auras towered up into the sky, and their eyes were filled with killing intent. When Lan Zhuing saw this, her pretty face froze, and she could not help but be stunned. She actually didn't realize that someone was following them. Following that, she seemed to have discovered something. Her expression suddenly changed, and her expression became a little strange. She seemed to be very flustered. Nie Tian glanced at Lan Zhuing and frowned. He then looked at the dozens of black-clothed cultivators and said, We just came out of the Qiankuan sect, and you have been following us for a whole day. Aren't you tired? It turned out that when Nie Tian and Lan Zhuing left the Qiankuan Gate, this group of black-clothed men followed them. Nie Tian had noticed them a long time ago, but he didn't say anything until they reached the other side of the Qiankuan mountain range. Initially, he thought that the group of men in black were coming for him. But now, he realized that their target was Lan Zhuing. All the black-clad cultivators fixed their gazes on Lan Zhuing. Nie Tian guessed that these people should be guarding outside the Qiankuan Gate, waiting for them to leave. Brat, this is a matter of our high paradise heavens. It has nothing to do with you. You can still make it if you leave now. At this moment, the leader of the black-clothed cultivators spoke coldly. A cold light flickered in his eyes. He had no interest in Nie Tian and was only here to capture Lan Zhuing. Oh! The corner of Nie Tian's mouth twitched. He smiled playfully and said, I'm friends with Lan Zhuing. It's a bit hard for me to leave now. Brat, do you know who she is? The black-clothed man's eyes darkened, and he released a chill and killing intent at the same time. I don't know anything else. All I know is that she's my friend. Nie Tian's lips twitched as he smiled faintly. This black-clothed man wasn't weak. He was a first-level heavenly righteousness saint. But such strength wasn't enough to make Nie Tian retreat. Nie Tian was confident that he might be able to fight with a first-level heavenly righteousness saint if he was in his peak condition. Most importantly, he couldn't leave without doing anything. Nie Tian, leave. But at this moment, Lan Zhuing suddenly spoke. She looked at Nie Tian and said in a deep voice, Do you really want me to leave, or do you not want to implicate me? Nie Tian's eyes narrowed as he looked straight at Lan Zhuing. Of course, he could see Lan Zhuing's helplessness. The latter was speaking against her will. Lan Zhuing's beautiful eyes flickered, and she didn't know what to say. Lan Zhuing, you helped me once. This time, it's my turn to help you. Nie Tian smiled faintly. He then looked at the dozens of black-clothed martial artists and said loudly, With me here, they won't be able to touch you. Is that so? When the black-clothed man heard Nie Tian's words, he couldn't help but sneer. His eyes were cold and contemptuous. He took a step in the air and released a powerful aura. I want to see what a mere holy disciple is capable of. How dare he say such big words? It was obvious that this black-clothed man didn't understand Nie Tian at all. It was no wonder. They couldn't enter the Qiankuan Gate at all. Of course, they wouldn't know Nie Tian's true strength. You can try. The corner of Nie Tian's mouth twitched as he looked at the powerful aura in the sky. A cold smile appeared on his face as a sword aura rose from his body. Like a huge sword, it shot up into the sky, majestic and powerful. Bang! The next moment, the two terrifying auras collided with each other. The air shook, and a muffled explosion was heard. The two auras collapsed at the same time. The black-clothed man was forced to take a few steps back. After he steadied himself, he couldn't help but exclaim in surprise. The way he looked at Nye Tian was filled with horror. He simply didn't dare to believe that Nye Tian actually broke through his oppressive aura so easily. He was a Lord Saint. When he released his aura, any martial artist below the 5th rank of the Heavenly Mandate realm would be killed directly. But in front of him, a martial artist at the 8th rank of the Heavenly Mandate realm had broken through his aura. How could he not be surprised? Now do you know what I'm capable of? Nye Tian smiled faintly. The corners of his mouth curled up into a cold, disdainful smile. Son of a bitch, you're courting death. The black-clothed man's pupils suddenly constricted, and his face was extremely gloomy. He let out a wild roar, and the aura on his body rose to the limit. He took a step forward madly, and the space around him trembled. After that, he slapped out with his palm, and a boundless palm shadow appeared in the sky. It pressed down towards the heavens and the earth with the intention of killing Nye Tian. Nye Tian, watch out! Lan Zhuiying couldn't help but scream. She knew that Nye Tian's strength was insane. Martial artists of the same level couldn't be compared to him. But at this moment, Nye Tian was facing a saint of Tianyi. They weren't on the same level at all. Soul of the sky, open! Nye Tian sensed the immense pressure over his head. His eyes narrowed slightly, and without the slightest hesitation, he activated his Haotian soul. In the next moment, a terrifying force circulated throughout his body, instantly pushing his sword intent to the limit. 9 heavens of sword aura. The moment the soul of the sky was opened, Nye Tian's swordsmanship realm soared from the 4th heaven of sword aura to the 9th heaven of sword aura. The soul of the sky had just awakened. Nye Tian didn't even know what kind of power it was. However, when the soul of the sky was awakened, it swallowed the spirit of sky evolution and the spirit of Omnigeddon. Therefore, when it was opened, Nye Tian's swordsmanship realm soared to the 5th heaven. Sacred heaven-defying sword, unity of heaven and man, sacrifice of the sun. In the next moment, Nye Tian let out a low roar without the slightest hesitation. Suddenly, sword intent surged out of his entire body. The clear sky sword pierced the sky, and a sword shadow rumbled out. It was actually burning with flames, and it was wrapped in 9 different types of sword intent. The power of sword aura. Lan Zhuiying looked at the sword shadow in the air, and her beautiful eyes trembled. Nye Tian was too fierce. He gathered the power of 9 sword auras and went all out. Buzz! At this moment, the sword shadow shot up to the sky and a sword cry was heard. It had the power to pierce through the clouds and crack rocks. It seemed like it was going to destroy everything.